the novel of critical thinking. Learn strategic decision-making through real stories of transformation. Prologue, the question that changes everything. The rain drummed against the tall windows of Pemberton University's philosophy department, creating rivulets that distorted the view of the ancient oak trees lining the quad. Dr. Margaret Blackwell stood at the podium, her silver hair catching the fluorescent light as she surveyed the packed lecture hall. 250 students sat before her, most clutching smartphones and laptops, ready to capture every word of what many consider the most challenging course on campus, critical thinking and strategic decision-making. "Before we begin," Dr. Blackwell said, her voice carrying easily to the back rows, "I want you to close your devices. Put them away completely." A collective murmur rippled through the auditorium. Students exchanged glances, some looking genuinely distressed at the prospect of disconnecting, even temporarily. "I can see the panic in your eyes," she continued with a slight smile. "But this exercise isn't about punishment. It's about presence. You see, critical thinking begins with a simple but revolutionary act, the decision to think before you react." Slowly, reluctantly, devices disappeared into backpacks and pockets. The room settled into an unusual quiet, broken only by the persistent rain and the occasional creak of wooden seats. "Now," Dr. Blackwell walked to the center of the stage, abandoning the safety of her podium. "I want you to consider a question. Not answer it immediately, just consider it. The question is this: what if everything you think you know about making good decisions is wrong?" She paused, letting the words settle over the room like dust motes in afternoon sunlight. Some of you are already formulating responses. Others are dismissing the question entirely. A few are wondering if this is some sort of philosophical trap. All of these reactions are perfectly normal, and all of them demonstrate exactly what we'll be exploring together this semester. Dr. Blackwell began walking slowly across the front of the room, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. 3 months ago, I received a call from the CEO of Meridian Industries, one of the largest consulting firms in the country. They had a problem. Their brightest minds, graduates from the best universities, armed with the latest analytical tools, were making decisions that looked brilliant on paper but failed spectacularly in practice. They wanted to know if I could help them understand why intelligence and good intentions weren't enough. She stopped walking and faced the audience directly. The answer, as you might suspect, lies in how we think about thinking itself. You see, most of us operate under a dangerous illusion that more information always leads to better decisions, that faster thinking is superior to slower thinking, that confidence equals competence. A hand shot up in the third row. Dr. Blackwell nodded toward a young woman with bright red hair and an earnest expression. "Professor Blackwell, are you saying that being smart doesn't matter?" "Excellent question, miss." Sarah Chun. "Miss Chun, what I'm suggesting is that raw intelligence is like a powerful engine in a car. It can get you places quickly, but if you don't know how to steer, you'll end up in a ditch at high speed." Dr. Blackwell moved a whiteboard and wrote a single word in large letters. Pause. Strategic thinking, truly effective decision-making, begins with what I call the strategic pause. It's the space between stimulus and response, between feeling and action, between impulse and choice. In that space lies all human freedom and all human power. She turned back to the class, noting how some students were leaning forward, engaged despite the absence of their digital crutches. Over the next several months, we're going to follow the journey of several individuals who learned to master this pause. Their stories aren't fictional case studies or theoretical examples. They're based on real people who discovered that the quality of their thinking determined the quality of their lives. Dr. Blackwell walked to a different section of the whiteboard and wrote, "The strategic mind." You'll meet James Morrison, a business analyst who thought that having all the data meant he had all the answers. You'll encounter Sarah Peterson, a project manager who confused being busy with being productive. You'll follow Dr. Emily Rodriguez, a surgeon who discovered that life-and-death decisions in the operating room require the same thinking skills as everyday choices about career, relationships, and personal growth. The rain outside began to intensify, creating a steady rhythm against the windows. Dr. Blackwell noticed that not a single student was checking their phone or looking at the door. Something was happening in the room, a quality of attention that she'd learned to recognize over 20 years of teaching. Each of these individuals faced a moment when their usual ways of thinking and deciding simply weren't enough. They discovered that strategic thinking isn't about being clever or having a high IQ. It's about developing specific mental habits that anyone can learn. She moved to the center of the room again, her voice taking on a more personal tone. I want to share something with you that I don't usually discuss in academic settings. 5 years ago, I thought I understood decision-making. I had published papers, consulted with corporations, taught thousands of students. Then my own life fell apart in ways that my expertise couldn't prevent or fix. The room grew even quieter, if such a thing were possible. My marriage ended after 23 years, not because of any dramatic crisis, but because of 1,000 small decisions that gradually eroded what we had built together. My daughter stopped speaking to me because I had been so focused on being right that I forgot how to truly listen. My health suffered because I had been so busy teaching others about strategic thinking that I forgot to apply it to my own life. Dr. Blackwell paused, not for dramatic effect, but because the memories still carried weight. It was during that dark period that I began to understand the difference between knowing about strategic thinking and actually living it. The principles we'll explore together aren't just academic concepts. They're tools for building a life worth living. She walked to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked campus where students hurried between buildings, most of them staring at their phones as they navigated puddles and pathways. The characters you'll meet in our story represent different aspects of the strategic mind in development. Through their struggles and discoveries, you'll learn to recognize the mental traps that keep smart people stuck, the cognitive biases that turn good intentions into poor outcomes, and the simple but powerful practices that transform reactive thinking into strategic thinking. Turning back to the class, Dr. Blackwell noticed that the earlier restlessness had completely disappeared. Students were sitting still, present in a way that was becoming increasingly rare in an age of constant distraction. But here's what I want you to understand from the very beginning. This isn't a course about thinking better, so you can get more of what you want. It's about thinking better so you can become clearer about what's actually worth wanting. She walked to the whiteboard and added 3 words below the strategic mind: clarity, patience, wisdom. Strategic thinking begins with clarity. Seeing situations as they really are, not as we wish they were or fear they might be. It requires patience, the willingness to slow down in a world that demands speed. And it cultivates wisdom, the ability to distinguish between what we can control and what we cannot, what matters and what merely feels urgent. A different student raised her hand, a woman with short blonde hair, sitting near the middle of the room. Professor, how do we know when we're thinking strategically versus just overthinking everything? Dr. Blackwell smiled. Another excellent question. What's your name? Jennifer Walsh. Miss Walsh, that distinction between strategic thinking and overthinking is crucial. Strategic thinking has a quality of calm alertness. It's focused on outcomes and actions. Overthinking, on the other hand, tends to be anxious and circular. It generates heat without light, motion without progress. She wrote outcome-focused on the whiteboard. One of the characters you'll meet, Thomas Bennett, is a perfect example of someone who initially confused analysis paralysis with thoughtful decision-making. His journey shows us how to use thinking as a tool rather than letting thinking use us. The rain outside began to lighten, and filtered sunlight started to illuminate the room differently. Dr. Blackwell noticed how the changing light seemed to mirror the shifting energy in the classroom. I want to leave you today with a challenge. For the next week, I want you to practice what I call the 3-second rule. Before you respond to any significant question, before you make any decision that matters, before you react to any situation that triggers strong emotions, pause for 3 seconds. She held up 3 fingers. 3 seconds. Count them, 1, 2, 3. In those 3 seconds, ask yourself, what outcome do I actually want here? What would my wisest self do in this situation? What would I choose if I were thinking strategically rather than reactively? Dr. Blackwell moved toward the door, then stopped and turned back to face the class. I know 3 seconds doesn't sound like much, but I promise you this. If you consistently create that small space between impulse and action, you'll be amazed at how different your life begins to look. Strategic thinking doesn't require you to become a different person. It simply asks you to become a more intentional version of who you already are. As students began gathering their belongings, Dr. Blackwell added one final thought. The story we're about to explore together isn't just about other people learning to think strategically. It's about you discovering the strategic mind that already exists within you, waiting to be developed and applied to every aspect of your life. The room buzzed with quiet conversation as students filed out, many of them still discussing the ideas they'd just encountered. Dr. Blackwell watched them go, remembering her own first encounter with strategic thinking principles 30 years earlier. She had been about their age, equally certain that she understood how the world worked, equally unprepared for the challenges that would test that understanding. As the last student left the room, Dr. Blackwell turned back to the whiteboard and added one more word below the others: journey. Because that's what strategic thinking really was. Not a destination to reach, but a way of traveling through life with greater intention, clarity, and wisdom. The characters they would meet in the coming weeks had all discovered this truth in their own ways, through their own struggles and insights. Their stories, she knew, would become the students' stories. And perhaps, if she did her job well, some of these students would avoid the painful lessons that come from trying to navigate life without a strategic compass. The rain had stopped completely now, and sunlight streamed to the tall windows, illuminating the empty chairs and the words on the whiteboard. The strategic mind, clarity, patience, wisdom, outcome-focused, journey. Dr. Blackwell smiled as she gathered her materials. The real journey was about to begin. Chapter 1, The Data Trap. James Morrison adjusted his tie for the third time as he walked through the gleaming corridors of Meridian Industries' Manhattan headquarters. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors. At 28, James had already earned a reputation as one of the company's most thorough analysts, a reputation that was about to be tested in ways he couldn't imagine. Morrison, the voice of Richard Caldwell, senior partner, echoed down the hallway. Conference room 3. Now. James quickened his pace, his leather briefcase heavy with printouts, charts, and 3 different laptops. He had spent the previous 72 hours preparing for this moment, the presentation that would determine whether Meridian Industries would pursue the largest acquisition in the company's history. The conference room was already buzzing with activity when James arrived. 12 executives sat around an oval mahogany table, each with tablets and coffee cups positioned with military precision. At the head of the table sat Victoria Sterling, the CEO whose legendary attention to detail had built Meridian from a small consulting firm into a global powerhouse. Gentlemen, ladies, Victoria's voice commanded immediate silence. Mr. Morrison has spent the past month analyzing the Hartwell Manufacturing acquisition. James, the floor is yours. James stood and activated the wall-mounted display. His first slide appeared, Hartwell Manufacturing, a comprehensive data analysis. The screen filled with colorful charts, graphs, and financial projections that represented hundreds of hours of meticulous work. Thank you, Ms. Sterling. James began, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. I've conducted a thorough quantitative analysis of Hartwell Manufacturing across 47 key performance indicators. He clicked to the next slide, a complex spreadsheet showing revenue trends over the past 5 years. Hartwell's revenue has grown consistently at 12.7% annually, outpacing industry average by 3.2%. Their EBITDA margins have improved from 18% to 23% over the same period. James noticed several executives nodding approvingly. He felt a surge of confidence and continued with his presentation. Moving to operational metrics, he clicked again, revealing a slide dense with numerical data. Their production efficiency has increased 15% since implementing lean manufacturing principles. Quality scores have improved across all product lines. Customer retention rates exceed industry benchmarks by 8%. For the next 20 minutes, James methodically worked through his analysis, market share data, competitive positioning, technology assessments, financial projections, risk matrices. Every conceivable metric had been calculated, compared, and cross-referenced. Based on this comprehensive analysis, James concluded, I recommend proceeding with the acquisition. The data clearly supports a purchase price of $340 million, with projected ROI of 18% within 3 years. The room fell silent. James looked around the table, expecting approval, perhaps even praise for the thoroughness of his work. Instead, he saw furrowed brows and exchanged glances. Victoria Sterling leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in front of her face. "Mr. Morrison," she said slowly, "your analysis is certainly comprehensive, but I have a question for you." "Of course, Miss Sterling. Have you actually been to one of Hartwell's facilities?" James felt a slight chill run down his spine. "Well, no, ma'am. I conducted my analysis using publicly available financial data, industry reports, and third-party assessments. I felt that approach would provide the most objective. Have you spoken with any of Hartwell's employees, customers, suppliers?" "I know. I relied on customer satisfaction surveys and supplier relationship data from." Victoria held up her hand. "Mr. Morrison, let me share something with you. Yesterday, I spent 3 hours touring Hartwell's main production facility in Ohio. Would you like to know what I discovered?" James nodded, though his confidence was rapidly evaporating. "I discovered that while the numbers look impressive, the reality is quite different. The production efficiency gains you cited, they came from pushing a workforce to unsustainable levels. Employee turnover has tripled in the past year. The quality improvements, they're masking significant maintenance deferrals that will require millions in capital investment." Victoria stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. "Most importantly, I discovered that Hartwell's founder and CEO, Margaret Hartwell, is planning to retire in 6 months. Her departure will trigger the loss of 3 major customer contracts that represent 40% of their revenue. This information isn't in any public filing or industry report." The room was absolutely silent now. James felt his carefully constructed analysis crumbling around him. "Mr. Morrison," Victoria continued, "you provided us with an excellent example of what I call the data trap. The belief that having more information automatically leads to better decisions." She returned to her seat and looked directly at James. "Your analysis assumes that past performance predicts future results. It assumes that numbers tell the complete story. It assumes that data points exist in isolation from human realities. These assumptions, while common, can be dangerous." Richard Caldwell cleared his throat. "James, no one questions your analytical skills. But Ms. Sterling has identified a critical gap in your approach. You've analyzed Hartwell as a collection of metrics rather than as a living, breathing organization." James felt his face flush. I understand. But how was I supposed to know about the CEO's retirement plans? That information wasn't available through normal channels." "Exactly," Victoria said. "And that's the lesson. Strategic thinking requires more than data analysis. It requires what I call strategic intelligence, the ability to see beyond numbers, to understand the human dynamics, the unspoken realities, the context that gives meaning to metrics." She gestured toward James's presentation, still displayed on the wall. "Your analysis answered question, what do the numbers say? But it didn't address more important questions. What do the numbers show? What assumptions am I making? What could I be missing? What would change my conclusion?" David Chun, the head of due diligence, leaned forward. "James, let me ask you something. When you started this analysis, what outcome were you hoping for?" The question caught James off guard. Well, I wanted to provide an accurate assessment that would help the company make the right decision. But did you have a preference? Did you want the acquisition to look attractive?" James hesitated. The honest answer was yes. He had been excited about the project and had hoped to uncover a compelling investment opportunity. Yes, I was hoping it would be a good opportunity." "And how might that hope have influenced your analysis?" David asked gently. James felt an uncomfortable realization dawning. He had approached the data, looking for confirmation rather than truth. He had emphasized the positive metrics and downplayed concerning trends. He had, without realizing it, allowed his desire for a particular outcome to shape his supposedly objective analysis. "I see what you're getting at," James said quietly. I may have been looking for data to support conclusion rather than following the data to wherever it led. Victoria nodded. That's called confirmation bias, and it's one of the most common traps in analytical work. We unconsciously seek information that supports what we want to believe and ignore or minimize information that challenges our preferred narrative. She walked to the whiteboard and wrote, "Strategic questions. Let me share with you the approach I use in evaluating Hartwell. Instead of starting with data collection, I started with strategic questions." She began writing on the board. What don't I know that I need to know? What assumptions am I making? Who has information that isn't in the public domain? What would cause this investment to fail? What would I need to see to change my mind? James studied the questions, recognizing how different this approach was from his own. Strategic thinking, Victoria continued, begins with intellectual humility, the recognition that our first impressions might be wrong, that data without context can mislead, that the most important information is often the hardest to find. She turned back to James. "I want you to understand something. Your analytical skills are impressive, but skills without wisdom can be dangerous. The goal isn't to eliminate analysis. It's to combine rigorous analysis with strategic thinking." Patricia Williams, the head of human resources, spoke up. "James, let me give you a practical example. Your data showed that Hartwell's employee satisfaction scores were above industry average. But when I called 3 executive recruiting firms that specialize in manufacturing talent, I learned that Hartwell employees have been quietly reaching out for new opportunities at unprecedented rates. How did you know to make those calls?" James asked, "Because I asked myself, if I worked at Hartwell, what might I be feeling right now? If the company were being acquired, how might that affect my career plans? Employee satisfaction surveys capture how people felt in the past, but recruiting activity reveals what they're planning for the future." James was beginning to see the pattern. Strategic thinking meant looking beyond the obvious, questioning assumptions, and seeking information that wasn't readily available. "So what's the next step?" he asked. Victoria returned to her seat. "I'm postponing the acquisition decision for 60 days. During that time, I want you to conduct a different kind of analysis. Instead of focusing primarily on numbers, I want you to understand the human story behind those numbers." She handed James a piece of paper with names and contact information. "These are 3 former Hartwell employees, 2 current suppliers, and a competitor who tried to recruit their head of engineering last year. I want you to have conversations with each of them, not formal interviews, conversations. Listen to their stories. Ask about their experiences. Try to understand what it's really like to work with or for Hartwell." James looked at the list, feeling both intimidated and intrigued. "But how do I know if what they tell me is accurate? People have biases too, right?" "Absolutely," Victoria replied. "That's why you'll also visit their facilities, attend an industry conference where Hartwell will be presenting, and spend time with their customers. You're not looking for a single source of truth. You're building a 3-dimensional understanding of the organization." Richard Caldwell added, "Think of it as triangulation. Individual data points can mislead. Individual stories can be biased. But when you combine quantitative analysis with qualitative insights from multiple perspectives, patterns emerge that you would never see otherwise." "I have one more challenge for you," Victoria said. "I want you to actively look for information that contradicts your initial recommendation. Force yourself to build the strongest possible case against the acquisition." James felt his stomach tighten. "You want me to argue against my own analysis?" "I want you to test your analysis. One of the most powerful tools in strategic thinking is something called red team thinking, deliberately trying to poke holes in your own conclusions. If your recommendation can't withstand that scrutiny, it probably needs revision." David Chin smiled. "James, think of it this way. Would you rather discover flaws in your analysis now in this room or later after we've invested $340 million? The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, with various executives sharing examples of decisions that had looked good on paper but failed in reality. James listened intently, beginning to understand that his education in strategic thinking had only just begun. As the meeting concluded, Victoria approached him privately. "James, I want you to know that what happened here today isn't a criticism of your abilities. It's an investment in your development. The most dangerous analysts are those who mistake thoroughness for wisdom, data for insight, and confidence for competence. She paused, studying his face. You have the analytical foundation. Now you need to develop what I call strategic intuition, the ability to sense what questions to ask, what patterns to look for, and what stories the data might be hiding. How do I develop that? James asked. By getting comfortable with uncertainty, by practicing intellectual humility, by remembering that the goal isn't to be right, it's to make the best decision possible with the information available. As James left the conference room, his mind was spinning. Everything he thought he knew about analysis and decision-making had been challenged in the span of an hour. The data he had trusted so completely now seemed insufficient, maybe even misleading. Walking back to his office, James reflected on Victoria's questions. What assumptions had he made? What information had he not sought? How had his own biases shaped his conclusions? He sat at his desk and opened a new document on his computer. Instead of starting with data collection, he began with Victoria's strategic questions. What do I know about Hartwell that I need to know? What assumptions am I making about their business model? Who has information that isn't publicly available? What would cause this acquisition to fail? What would I need to see to change my recommendation? For the first time in his career, James found himself more excited about the questions than the answers. He was beginning to understand that strategic thinking wasn't about having all the information. It was about knowing what information mattered and having the wisdom to seek it out. Over the next several weeks, James would discover that this shift in thinking would transform not just his approach to business analysis, but his entire approach to making decisions. The journey from reactive analysis to strategic thinking had begun. As he picked up the phone to call the first person on Victoria's list, James realized that he was about to learn something that no business school had taught him, that the most important data often came not from spreadsheets and databases, but from conversations, observations, and the willingness to question everything he thought he knew. Chapter 2. The Urgency Illusion. Sarah Peterson's phone buzzed for the 15th time in 30 minutes as she hurried through the corridors of TechFlow Solutions, a mid-sized software company nestled in Austin's thriving downtown district. Her Converse sneakers squeaked against the polished concrete floors as she juggled her laptop bag, a stack of project folders, and a rapidly cooling cup of coffee that threatened to spill with each hurried step. Sarah, thank God you're here, called Marcus Williams, the head of product development, from across the open plan office. His voice carried the familiar tone of barely controlled panic that had become the company's unofficial soundtrack. We need to talk about the Phoenix project. Now. Sarah glanced at her smartwatch, 7:43 a.m. She had been hoping for at least 15 minutes to review her notes before the chaos began, but in the 18 months since she'd been promoted to senior project manager, quiet moments had become as rare as snow in Texas. Give me 2 minutes to put my stuff down, she called back, weaving through the maze of standing desks and collaboration pods that some consultant had convinced management would boost creativity and productivity. Instead, they had created an environment where privacy was impossible and concentration was nearly extinct. Sarah's desk looked like the aftermath of a small explosion. Post-it notes covered her monitor in rainbow layers, each one representing a different urgent task, deadline, or crisis that required immediate attention. Her calendar was a Tetris puzzle of back-to-back meetings, many of them scheduled by other people who marked them as urgent or ASAP. She had 12 minutes before her first official meeting of the day, a status update for the Phoenix project that Marcus was already panicking about. 12 minutes to somehow make sense of the 17 new emails that had arrived since she checked her phone in the parking garage, the 4 Slack notifications flashing on her computer screen, and the 3 voicemails from clients who needed quick answers to questions that would require hours of research. Sarah, Marcus appeared at her desk, slightly out of breath. We have a problem. Jason from the client side just called. They want to move the Phoenix launch up by 3 weeks. Sarah felt her stomach drop. The Phoenix project, a custom software solution for a major retail client, was already running on an aggressive timeline. Moving it up by 3 weeks would be like asking someone to run a marathon in hiking boots. 3 weeks? She said, minimizing her email to focus on Marcus. That's impossible. We're already working weekends to hit the original deadline. I know. Marcus ran his hands through his hair, a gesture that had become his trademark during stressful periods. But they're launching a new product line for Black Friday, and they need our system integrated before they go live with their marketing campaign. Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with every new crisis. Her mind immediately began racing through possibilities. Could they cut corners on testing? Could they reassign developers from other projects? Could they somehow convince the client that the original timeline was non-negotiable? Who else knows about this? She asked. Just me and Jennifer from account management. We're meeting with the team at 9 to figure out how to make it work. As Marcus hurried away to handle another crisis, Sarah stared at her computer screen without really seeing it. The Phoenix project was already consuming 60-hour weeks from her 8-person development team. The designers were exhausted. The quality assurance team was falling behind on other projects. And now they want to compress an already compressed timeline even further. She opened her project management software and looked at the Phoenix timeline. Every task was color-coded. Red for behind schedule, yellow for at risk, green for on track. The screen looked like a Christmas tree designed by someone having a panic attack. More red than green, with yellow serving as an uncomfortable middle ground. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from her boyfriend, David. Still on for dinner tonight? Haven't seen you before 9 p.m. in 2 weeks. Sarah stared at the message, feeling a familiar pang of guilt. She had canceled their last 3 dinner plans because of work emergencies. Each time, she had promised it wouldn't happen again. Each time, she had meant it. She was about to respond when Jennifer Walsh, the account manager, appeared at her desk with a laptop and an expression that suggested more bad news. Sarah, we need to discuss the Morrison Industries project. They're threatening to pull out if we don't deliver the beta version by Friday. What? Sarah looked at her calendar. Today was Tuesday. Jennifer, we agreed on next Friday. That gives us 8 more days. I know, but their board meeting got moved up. They need to demonstrate our solution to secure budget approval for next year. Sarah felt something inside her snap, not in an explosive way, but like a rubber band that had been stretched too far for too long. Jennifer, can I ask you something? Of course. How many times this month has a client asked us to move up a deadline? Jennifer thought for a moment. I don't know exactly, but 7 times, Sarah said. 7 times in 4 weeks. And how many times have we said no? Well, we try to be accommodating. 0 times. We've said no 0 times. We've compressed schedules, worked weekends, pulled people off other projects, and stressed our team to the breaking point. And somehow, we keep getting more requests for impossible timelines. Jennifer shifted uncomfortably. Sarah, I understand you're feeling overwhelmed, but these clients are important. If we can't deliver what they need when they need it, they'll find someone who can. Sarah took a deep breath. For the first time in months, she found herself pausing instead of immediately problem-solving. In that pause, a question emerged that she hadn't thought to ask before. What if the way we're responding to these urgent requests is actually creating more urgent requests? Jennifer, can you sit down for a minute? I want to try something different. Jennifer looked at her watch. I have a client call in 10 minutes. This will take 5 minutes, and it might change how we handle that call. Reluctantly, Jennifer sat down. Sarah turned her computer screen so they could both see the project management dashboard. Look at this, Sarah said, pointing to the timeline view. Every project we have is marked as urgent or high priority. Every deadline is described as critical. Every request is labeled as ASAP. Jennifer studied the screen. Okay, but that's because our clients have real business needs. These deadlines aren't arbitrary. I'm not saying they're arbitrary, but I'm wondering if we created a system where everything is urgent, so nothing actually is. Sarah opened a new document and wrote 3 questions at the top. What happens if we say no? What's the real cost of always saying yes? What would change if we help clients plan better instead of enabling poor planning? Jennifer read the questions. Sarah, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but we can't just start saying no to clients. That's not how you build relationships. But what kind of relationships are we building? Look at our team turnover rate. Look at how many projects are running late, because we keep shifting resources to handle the latest crisis. Look at the quality issues we've had, because we're always rushing. Sarah pulled up another screen showing team metrics. 3 people have quit in the past 6 months. Our average project is running 20% over budget because of scope creep and compressed timelines. Client satisfaction scores are actually declining, not improving. For the first time, Jennifer was quiet. What if, Sarah continued, instead of enabling this cycle, we help break it? What if we started having different conversations with clients? What do you mean? Sarah leaned back in her chair, thinking about something she had read recently about strategic thinking. The article had talked about the difference between reactive problem solving and proactive pattern recognition. Jennifer, what if the Morrison Industries deadline isn't actually about their board meeting? What if it's about something else entirely? Like what? I don't know. That's the point. Instead of immediately figuring out how to meet their new timeline, what if we ask better questions? What if we try to understand the real problem they're trying to solve? Jennifer checked her watch again. Sarah, this is all very philosophical, but I have 3 minutes before my call, and I need to know what to tell Morrison Industries. Sarah felt the familiar pressure to provide an immediate answer. But instead of giving in to that pressure, she found herself applying the 3-second pause that Dr. Blackwell had mentioned in an article she'd read during her lunch break the previous week. 1, 2, 3. Tell them you'll call them back in 2 hours with a strategic response rather than a reactive one. What? Jennifer, what outcome do we actually want here? Do we want to say yes to another impossible deadline and stress our team even further? Do we want to deliver something rushed that might not meet their real needs? Or do we want to have a conversation about how to solve their actual problem? Jennifer stared at her. Sarah, are you feeling okay? This doesn't sound like you. Sarah laughed, realizing that Jennifer was right. The old Sarah would have immediately started rearranging resources, calling emergency team meetings, and figuring out how to deliver the impossible. But something was shifting in her thinking. I'm feeling tired, Sarah said honestly. Tired of always being in crisis mode. Tired of saying yes to everything, and then scrambling to make it work. Tired of managing projects instead of leading them. She turned to face Jennifer directly. What if we tried something different? What if, instead of asking, how can we make this work, we started asking, what's the smartest approach here? Before Jennifer could respond, Sarah's computer chimed with a calendar reminder. Team meeting in 5 minutes. She looked at the notification and made a decision that surprised even her. She canceled the meeting. Sarah, what are you doing? Jennifer asked. The team is expecting. The team is expecting another emergency meeting where we figure out how to do impossible things in impossible time frames. But what if instead we use this time to think strategically about how we want to respond to these requests? Sarah stood up and walked to the whiteboard that dominated one wall of the open office space. She wrote in large letters, "What's the real problem? Jennifer, humor me for 15 minutes. Let's approach the Morrison situation differently." Reluctantly, Jennifer followed her to whiteboard. Sarah wrote Morrison Industries at the top and drew a line underneath. Okay, they say they need the beta by Friday because their board meeting moved up, but let's dig deeper. What are they really trying to accomplish in that board meeting? They need to demonstrate our solution to get budget approval. Right. And what specifically do they need to demonstrate? Jennifer thought for a moment that our software can handle their transaction volume during peak periods. So the real question isn't whether we can deliver the full beta by Friday. The real question is whether we can demonstrate the specific functionality they need to show their board. Sarah wrote on the whiteboard, "Core question. What's the minimum viable demonstration?" That's a very different problem to solve, Jennifer realized. Exactly. And it might not require moving up the entire project timeline. Sarah felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. Instead of feeling pressure to solve everything immediately, she was beginning to see the situation more clearly. Let me ask you another question, Sarah said. How did Morrison Industries board meeting get moved up in the first place? I think their CEO had a scheduling conflict, And how much advance notice did they give us about this change? Jennifer checked her phone. The call came in yesterday afternoon. Sarah wrote on the whiteboard. Pattern, last-minute schedule changes creating artificial urgency. Jennifer, what if this isn't actually about their board meeting? What if they're testing us to see how much we'll compromise our process to accommodate their requests? Jennifer looked skeptical. That seems a little paranoid. Maybe, but what if we approached it as a strategic question rather than an operational crisis? What if we called them back and said, "We understand you need to demonstrate key functionality to your board. Let's discuss the most effective way to do that within the constraints of quality and timeline." Sarah was writing rapidly on the whiteboard now, organizing her thoughts. Strategic response. Understand their real objective. Propose solution that meets their need without compromising quality. Reset expectations about timeline management. Establish better communication protocols for future projects. That's actually not bad, Jennifer admitted. But what if they say no? What if they insist on the original request? Then we'll need to make a strategic decision about whether this client relationship is sustainable long-term. But at least we'll be making that decision consciously instead of just reacting to pressure. Their conversation was interrupted by Marcus, who appeared looking even more frazzled than before. "Sarah, what happened to the 9 o'clock meeting?" "The whole Phoenix team is in the conference room waiting." Sarah looked at Marcus, then at the whiteboard, then back at Marcus. She realized she was at a decision point that would determine whether she continued operating in crisis mode or began transitioning to strategic thinking. "Marcus, can you give me 1 minute to finish this thought with Jennifer, and then I'll explain what I'm proposing?" "Sarah, we don't have time for..." "We don't have time not to think strategically about this. Give me 60 seconds. Marcus looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Sarah's tone made him pause. Sarah turned back to Jennifer. "Here's what I'm going to propose to Morrison Industries. We'll create a focused demonstration that showcases the exact functionality they need for their board meeting. It won't be the full beta, but it will be a polished, professional demonstration of the core features. This protects our timeline, ensures quality, and gives them what they actually need. And if they insist on the full beta, then we'll have a conversation about whether we're the right partner for them. But I suspect that if we approach this strategically rather than reactively, we'll find a solution that works for everyone." Jennifer was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay, let me try that approach." As Jennifer walked away to make her call, Sarah turned to Marcus. "Marcus, I want to propose something different for the Phoenix project meeting. Instead of immediately figuring out how to compress the timeline, what if we first understood what's really driving the client's request to move up the launch?" Marcus looked at her as if she had suggested they solve the problem through interpretive dance. "Sarah, they want to launch before Black Friday. That's what's driving the request. But why? What specifically happens if they launch a week later? What problem are they really trying to solve?" For the first time in months, Marcus stopped moving. He actually stood still and thought about the question. "You know what?" he said slowly. "I don't actually know. I just assumed that earlier was automatically better." Sarah felt a breakthrough happening, not just in her own thinking, but in the conversation. What if we found out? What if we approached this as strategic partners rather than order takers? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised them both. "Sarah, you know what? I'm tired of always being in crisis mode too. Let's try it your way." As they walked toward the conference room together, Sarah realized that she had discovered something important. The difference between managing urgency and creating strategy. For months, she had been so focused on responding to immediate demands that she had never stepped back to question whether those demands were actually urgent or just habitual. The shift from reactive to strategic thinking wasn't just about project management, she realized. It was about reclaiming control over her own attention, time, and energy, and maybe, just maybe, helping her team and clients do the same. Chapter 3. The Precision of Pressure. Dr. Emily Rodriguez stepped into the preoperative scrub room at St. Mary's Medical Center, the familiar ritual of preparation beginning to calm her mind despite the complexity of the surgery ahead. The morning sun filtered to the high windows, casting geometric shadows across the sterile surfaces as she began the methodical process of washing her hands. a routine she had performed thousands of times over 12 years as a cardiac surgeon. Today's case was challenging. A 63-year-old construction worker named Robert Chun, who needed a triple bypass. His coronary arteries were severely blocked, and the surgery would require precision, patience, and a kind of decision-making that left no room for error. But it wasn't the technical complexity that had Emily's mind working overtime. It was something else entirely. 3 weeks earlier, Emily had attended a medical conference where Dr. Atul Gawande had presented research on medical decision-making. His findings have been unsettling. Even experienced physicians, when faced with complex cases, often relied on intuition and pattern recognition rather than systematic thinking. More troubling, they frequently failed to consider alternative diagnoses or treatment options once they had settled on an initial approach. The presentation had forced Emily to examine her own decision-making process, and what she discovered had shaken her confidence in ways she wasn't comfortable acknowledging. Dr. Rodriguez? The voice of Dr. Michael Patel, the anesthesiologist, interrupted her thoughts. Ready to review the case? Emily nodded, finishing her scrub routine. Let's walk through it. They moved to the adjoining room where Robert Chen's medical records were displayed on a large monitor. Emily had reviewed the case multiple times, but something Dr. Gawande had said kept echoing in her mind. The most dangerous moment in medicine is when you think you know exactly what you're dealing with. Standard triple bypass, Dr. Patel said, pulling up the cardiac catheterization images. L80 90% blocked, circumflex 85%, right coronary completely occluded. Pretty straightforward. Emily studied the images, but instead of immediately confirming Dr. Patel's assessment, she found herself asking a question she rarely voiced. What else could this be? Dr. Patel looked at her with surprise. Emily, we've done the full workup. The angiogram is clear. This is exactly what it looks like. Severe coronary artery disease requiring surgical intervention. I know, Emily said slowly, but humor me for a moment. If we were wrong about something, anything, what would we be missing? Dr. Patel pulled up Mr. Chen's chart on his tablet. His symptoms are classic. Chest pain on exertion, shortness of breath, abnormal stress test. His risk factors are textbook. Smoking, hypertension, family history. The diagnostic imaging confirms severe blockages. Emily nodded, but something nagged at her. Tell me about his presentation in the emergency room. Chest pain, diaphoresis, elevated cardiac enzymes. Classic acute coronary syndrome. How long did he wait before coming to the hospital? Dr. Patel checked the notes. About 6 hours after symptom onset. And what was he doing when the symptoms started? Working construction. Heavy lifting. Emily paused. 6 hours was a long time for someone experiencing cardiac symptoms to wait before seeking help, especially during working hours when calling 911 would be straightforward. Did anyone ask him why he waited so long? Dr. Patel scrolled through the notes. Doesn't look like it. Why? Emily wasn't sure why the question seemed important, but something Dr. Gawande had said was resonating. Strategic thinking in medicine means asking not just what is this, but what else could this be? And what story aren't we hearing? Can we talk to him before surgery? Emily asked. Emily, we're scheduled to start in 20 minutes. He's already been prepped. 5 minutes. I just want to ask him a couple of questions. Dr. Patel looked puzzled, but nodded. I'll meet you in the OR. Emily made her way to the preoperative holding area, where Robert Chen lay on a gurney, his wife Maria holding his hand. Both looked nervous but trusting, the expression Emily had seen countless times from patients about to undergo major surgery. Mr. Chun, Emily said, pulling up a chair beside his bed. I'm Dr. Rodriguez. I'll be performing your surgery today. Thank you, doctor, Robert said, his voice slightly hoarse from the preoperative medications. I'm ready to get this over with. I have a couple quick questions, if that's okay. When you first started having chest pain yesterday, what were you doing exactly? Moving some heavy equipment at the job site. We were installing new scaffolding. And when did you realize something was wrong? Robert looked at his wife before answering. Well, at first I thought it was just strain from the lifting. But then the pain got worse, And Maria has been after me for months to see a doctor about my chest pain. Emily felt her attention sharpen. You've been having chest pain for months? On and off, usually when I'm working hard or stressed about something. Emily looked at Maria, who nodded confirmation. Mr. Chun, can you tell me about your job situation lately? Robert's expression changed, becoming more guarded. Why do you ask? I'm trying to understand a complete picture of what's been happening with your health. Robert exchanged another glance with his wife. Things have been tough. The construction company I work for has been laying people off. I've been working extra shifts, trying to prove I'm valuable enough to keep around. Maria squeezed her husband's hand. He's been working 7 days a week for 3 months, barely sleeping. I keep telling him the stress is making everything worse. Emily felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to rearrange themselves in her mind. Mr. Chun, when you came to the emergency room yesterday, was it because the pain was different from what you've been experiencing? Yeah, he said slowly. This time it didn't go away when I stopped working, and my arm started going numb. Emily nodded, making mental notes. One more question. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your stress level over the past 3 months? 11, Robert said without hesitation. Maria laughed grimly and nodded. Emily thanked him and made her way back toward the oar. But instead of proceeding directly to surgery, she stopped at a computer terminal and pulled up Robert Chen's complete medical history. What she found gave her pause. 6 months earlier, Robert had been seen in the emergency department for chest pain. The workup at that time had been normal. EKG unchanged, cardiac enzymes normal, stress test negative. He had been diagnosed with anxiety and discharged with instructions to follow up with his primary care physician. 3 months later, another ED visit. This time, a slightly abnormal EKG, but cardiac enzymes were still normal. He was scheduled for outpatient cardiology follow-up, but the appointment notes indicated he had canceled due to work conflicts. Emily stared at the timeline, thinking about what Dr. Gawanda had called diagnostic momentum, the tendency to pursue an initial diagnosis without adequately considering alternatives, especially when that diagnosis seemed obvious and supported by test results. She pulled up Robert's most recent lab work and noticed something she had glossed over in her initial review. His cortisol levels were significantly elevated, and his inflammatory markers were higher than what she would typically expect for someone with stable coronary artery disease. Dr. Patel appeared beside her. Emily, we really need to get started. Michael, can you look at something with me? She showed him the timeline and the lab results. What if we're dealing with more than just coronary artery disease? What if chronic stress is a bigger factor here than we've considered? Dr. Patel studied the information. Emily, the angiogram clearly shows severe blockages. Whatever role stress might be playing, he still needs surgical intervention. I'm not questioning whether he needs surgery, Emily said. I'm questioning whether we're addressing the complete problem. She turned to face Dr. Patel directly. What if we successfully revascularize his coronary arteries, but he goes back to the same work stress, the same lifestyle, the same chronic state of physiological arousal? What are the odds of long-term success? Dr. Patel was quiet for a moment. Are you suggesting we delay surgery? No. I'm suggesting we think strategically about what success looks like. If our goal is just to fix the blocked arteries, surgery is the answer. But if our goal is to optimize his long-term cardiac health and quality of life, we might need a more comprehensive approach. Emily realized she was applying the same kind of thinking that had been discussed in Dr. Gawanda's presentation, moving beyond the immediate technical problem to consider the broader context and longer-term outcomes. What are you proposing? Dr. Patel asked. I want to proceed with surgery, but I also want to make sure we're addressing the stress component as part of his treatment plan, and I want to modify our surgical approach slightly. How so? Emily pulled up the surgical plan on her tablet. Look at this. We plan a traditional approach. Open heart surgery, long recovery, significant time off work. But given what we know about his work situation and stress levels, what if we considered a less invasive approach? She scrolled to an alternative surgical option. Minimally invasive direct coronary artery bypass. Same outcome, but faster recovery, less trauma, and he could potentially return to work sooner. Dr. Patel studied the alternative plan. Emily, the traditional approach is what you know best. Why take on additional risk? It was a fair question, and one that got to the heart of strategic thinking in high-pressure situations. Emily realized she was at a decision point that would test whether she could apply strategic thinking principles even when the stakes were highest. Because the traditional approach optimizes for surgical success, but the minimally invasive approach optimizes for life success, she said. If Robert goes back to financial stress because he's been out of work for 3 months, we may have fixed his arteries but created new health problems. She paused, thinking through the implications. More importantly, I think we need to question our definition of surgical success. Is success defined as completing the technical procedure without complications? Or is success defined as improving this patient's long-term health and quality of life? Dr. Patel nodded slowly. That's actually a profound question. Emily felt the weight of the decision, but also a clarity she hadn't experienced before. Michael, what if we approached every case by asking not just how we fix the immediate problem, but how do we optimize the patient's overall outcome? They were interrupted by a nurse who informed them that the oar was ready and the patient was being transferred. As they walked toward the operating room, Emily made a decision that surprised her. Michael, I want to take 5 minutes before we begin to discuss the case with the entire surgical team. We've already done the briefing. I want to do a different kind of briefing. I want to share what we learned about the patient's stress levels and work situation, and I want the team to help me think through how we can optimize not just the surgery, but his recovery and long-term outcome. In the OR, Emily gathered the surgical team, 2 additional surgeons, 3 nurses, a perfusionist, and Dr. Patel. Before we begin, she said, I want to try something different. Instead of just reviewing the technical aspects of the surgery, I want us to think strategically about this patient's complete situation. She briefly explained what she had learned about Robert's work stress, the timeline of his symptoms, and the potential connection between his cardiovascular disease and chronic stress. So here's my question for all of you. How can we modify our approach, surgical technique, recovery protocols, discharge planning, to optimize this patient's long-term success, not just his immediate surgical outcome? The room was quiet for a moment. Then Lisa Martinez, the lead or nurse, spoke up. What if we coordinated with social services to address the work situation? Maybe there are resources to help with financial stress during recovery. Dr. Jennifer Park, the resident assisting with surgery, added, we could also modify the discharge instructions to include specific stress management techniques and connect them with cardiac rehabilitation that includes psychological support. Emily felt something shift in the room, a sense of collective engagement that went beyond technical execution. Those are exactly the kinds of strategic considerations I'm talking about, she said. Now, let's also think about the surgical approach itself. She explained her reasoning for considering the minimally invasive technique and asked for the team's input. The perfusionist, Tom Williams, raised a practical concern. Dr. Rodriguez, the minimally invasive approach has a steeper learning curve. Are you sure this is the right case to try something different? It was the question Emily had been grappling with herself. Was strategic thinking about optimal patient outcomes worth the additional risk that came with a less familiar surgical approach? That's exactly the right question to ask, she said. And it gets to the heart of strategic decision-making in high-stakes situations. She walked to the whiteboard in the corner of the OR and wrote, traditional approach, lower surgical risk, longer recovery, minimally invasive, higher surgical risk, faster recovery, patient factors, financial stress, job security, chronic stress. The strategic question isn't which approach is safer in isolation. It's which approach optimizes a specific patient's overall outcome, considering both surgical and life factors. Dr. Park studied the whiteboard. When you frame it that way, the minimally invasive approach seems more aligned with the specific needs. Emily nodded. But Tom raises an important point about my experience level with that technique. So let me ask another strategic question. What would reduce the surgical risk while still providing the benefits of faster recovery? Dr. Sarah Kim, the second attending surgeon, spoke up. What if we did a hybrid approach? Start with minimally invasive, but be prepared to convert to open surgery if we encounter any complications. Emily felt the pieces clicking into place. That's strategic thinking, optimizing for the desired outcome while having contingency plans for alternative scenarios. As the team prepared to begin surgery, Emily realized that the 5 minutes they had spent thinking strategically about the case had fundamentally changed their approach. They weren't just performing a technical procedure. They were solving a comprehensive problem. The surgery proceeded smoothly. The minimally invasive approach worked exactly as planned, and Robert's 3 blocked arteries were successfully bypassed with minimal trauma to surrounding tissue. But more importantly, the team's strategic approach to his case had created a recovery plan that addressed not just his cardiac health, but his financial stress, work situation, and long-term lifestyle factors. As Emily closed the final incision, she reflected on what had changed in her thinking. For years, she had approached surgery as a technical challenge to be executed with precision, but strategic thinking had helped her recognize that optimal patient care required considering factors that extended far beyond the operating room. The precision required for surgery, she realized, was the same precision required for strategic thinking: careful analysis, consideration of multiple factors, preparation for various scenarios, and clear focus on the desired outcome. But the most important insight was simpler. Strategic thinking didn't slow down decision-making in high-pressure situations. It made those decisions more effective. Chapter 4. The Pattern Behind the Chaos. Thomas Bennett sat in his home office at 2:17 a.m., surrounded by 3 laptops, 2 monitors, and enough energy drink cans to fuel a small spacecraft. The glow from multiple screens illuminated his face as he scrolled through what felt like the 1,000th article about cryptocurrency trends, market analysis, and investment strategies. His notebook lay open beside him, filled with charts, calculations, and decision trees that grew more complex with each passing hour. For the past 6 months, Thomas had been paralyzed by what should have been a simple decision: whether to invest a significant portion of his savings in a cryptocurrency portfolio. What had started as casual research had evolved into an obsession with gathering every possible piece of information before making a choice. The irony wasn't lost on him. As a data scientist for a Fortune 500 company, Thomas made complex analytical decisions every day. He could build predictive models, identify patterns in massive datasets, and provide strategic recommendations that influence million-dollar business decisions. But when it came to his own financial future, he found himself trapped in an endless cycle of analysis that produced more questions than answers. His phone buzzed with a text from his girlfriend, Rachel. "Tom, you missed dinner again. This is getting ridiculous. We need to talk." Thomas stared at the message, feeling a familiar knot form in his stomach. Rachel was right, of course. Over the past few months, his research obsession had consumed evenings, weekends, and most of his mental energy. He had told himself that this level of analysis was necessary for such an important financial decision. But deep down, he was beginning to suspect that something else was happening. He closed his laptop and walked to the kitchen, where Rachel was sitting at the table with her own computer, working on a presentation for her marketing job. "Rachel, I'm sorry about dinner. I got caught up in—" "Tom, sit down." Her voice was gentle but firm. "We need to talk about what's been happening." Thomas sat across from her, suddenly aware of how exhausted he felt despite the caffeine coursing through his system. "I know I've been distracted lately," he began, "but this investment decision is really important. I want to make sure I'm considering all the variables." Rachel closed her laptop and looked at him directly. "Tom, can I ask you something? What exactly are you trying to decide?" The question caught him off guard. Whether to invest in cryptocurrency, obviously. But what specifically? How much? Which currencies? What's your timeline? What would constitute success or failure? Thomas opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. After 6 months of research, he realized he couldn't answer any of those questions with precision. I'm still working through those details." Rachel leaned forward. "Tom, I've been watching you research this decision for half a year. You've read hundreds of articles, built spreadsheets, created models, and analyzed every possible scenario. But you seem further from making a decision now than when you started." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "What if the problem isn't that you don't have enough information? What if the problem is that you're trying to use information to avoid making a decision?" The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He had always prided himself on being thorough, analytical, rational. The idea that his analysis might be a form of avoidance rather than progress was deeply unsettling. Rachel, you don't understand. This is a complex financial decision with significant implications. I can't just guess. I'm not suggesting you guess, but I'm watching you try to achieve certainty about something that's inherently uncertain. And in the process, you're avoiding living your actual life. Thomas felt defensive, but also confused. What do you mean? Rachel pulled out her phone and showed him a calendar. Tom, in the past month, you've canceled 3 dinner plans with friends, skipped 2 family events, and we haven't had a real conversation that wasn't about cryptocurrency research in weeks. She scrolled through the calendar. You've spent more time researching this investment than you spent deciding where to go to graduate school, which job take, or even whether to move in together. Does that seem proportional to you? Thomas stared at the calendar, seeing the pattern Rachel was describing. The weight of the realization settled over him slowly. I think, he said quietly, I might be overthinking this. You think? Rachel smiled for the first time in the conversation. Tom, you've researched the cryptocurrency market more thoroughly than most professional analysts. At what point does more research become procrastination? The question hung in the air between them. Thomas recognized the truth in it, but felt lost about how to break the cycle he had created. I don't know how to decide without more information, he admitted. Rachel stood up and walked to a bookshelf, returning with a slim book titled The Paradox of Choice by Barry Schwartz. I picked this up last week, she said. It talks about how having too many options and too much information can actually make decision-making harder, not easier. She opened to a page she had bookmarked. Listen to this. Learning to choose is hard. Learning to choose well is harder. And learning to choose well in a world of unlimited possibilities is harder still, perhaps too hard. Thomas took the book and read the passage himself. Something about it resonated with his experience of the past 6 months. The author talks about the difference between maximizers and satisficers, Rachel continued. Maximizers try to make the perfect choice by considering every possible option. Satisficers set criteria for good enough and choose the first option that meets those criteria. And Thomas asked, the research shows that satisficers are actually happier with their decisions and experience less regret, even when maximizers technically make better choices. Thomas felt something shift in his understanding. So you're saying I'm trying to maximize when I should be satisficing? I'm saying maybe the goal isn't to make the perfect investment decision. Maybe the goal is to make a good decision and then move on with your life. Rachel sat back down and opened her laptop. Tom, can I show you something? She pulled up a simple spreadsheet with 3 columns: option, pros, and cons. This is how I made my decision about changing jobs last year. 3 options, basic pros and cons for each, and I chose the one that best aligned with my priorities. Thomas looked at the spreadsheet. It was elegantly simple compared to the complex models he had been building. But what if you missed something important? What if there were factors you didn't consider? There probably were, Rachel said. And you know what? The job turned out great anyway. Not perfect, but good enough to make me happy, while leaving mental energy for other parts of my life. Thomas realized he was seeing an example of strategic thinking that was completely different from his own approach. Rachel had focused on clarity about her priorities, gathered sufficient information to make an informed choice, and then acted decisively. Can I ask you something? Thomas said. How did you know when you had enough information to decide? Rachel thought for a moment. I gave myself a deadline. I said I would research for 2 weeks, and then I would make a decision based on what I learned in that time frame. But what if 2 weeks wasn't enough? Then I would make the best decision I could with the information available. Tom, there's never enough information to guarantee a perfect outcome. At some point, you have to trust your judgment and move forward. Thomas felt the truth of this, but also the fear that had been driving his endless research. What if I make the wrong choice? What if I lose money? What if I miss out on a huge opportunity? Rachel's expression softened. Tom, what if you spend the next year researching and miss out on actually living your life? What if the wrong choice teaches you something valuable? What if there is no perfect choice, only different trade-offs? She reached across the table and took his hand. I think you're trying to use analysis to eliminate risk, but that's not how life works. Strategic thinking isn't about avoiding all risks. It's about taking smart risks and learning from the outcomes. Thomas felt tears welling up in his eyes, surprising himself with the emotion that Rachel's words triggered. I think I'm scared, he said quietly. Of what? Of making a mistake. Of not being as smart as I think I am. Of having to live with the consequences of an imperfect decision. Rachel squeezed his hand. Tom, that's exactly why you're stuck. You're trying to use perfect analysis to avoid imperfect outcomes. But imperfect outcomes are part of life. They sat in silence for a few minutes, Thomas processing what Rachel had shared. So what do you think I should do? He asked. Rachel smiled. I think you should stop asking other people what you should do and start trusting your own judgment. She stood up and retrieved a legal pad from a drawer. But if you want a framework, here's what I'd suggest. Give yourself 1 week to make this decision. Not to do more research, to actually decide. She wrote Decision Framework at the top of the page. Step 1. Define what you're actually deciding. Not should I invest in cryptocurrency, but specific questions like, should I invest $X in Y currencies over Z time frame with ABC criteria for success? Thomas nodded, recognizing how much clearer this approach was in his open-ended research. Step 2. Identify your real priorities. Is this about maximizing returns? Diversify your portfolio? Learning about new technologies? Be honest about what you're really trying to accomplish. She continued writing. Step 3. Set minimum criteria for a good decision. What would need to be true for you to feel good about your choice? Focus on good enough, not perfect. Step 4. Choose based on your criteria, not your fears. Make the decision that best aligns with your priorities and meets your minimum criteria. And Step 5. Commit to learning from whatever happens. Whether the investment succeeds or fails, extract lessons that will improve your future decision-making. Thomas studied the framework, feeling both relief and anxiety. Relief because it provided a clear path forward, anxiety because it meant he could no longer hide behind endless research. What if I use this framework and still feel uncertain? Then you make the decision anyway, Rachel said gently. Uncertainty is information, Tom. It's telling you that this decision involves risk and unknowns. That's not a problem to solve. It's a reality to accept. She sat back down beside him. Tom, you're one of the smartest people I know. You have good judgment, strong analytical skills, and clear values. You don't need perfect information to make a good decision. You need to trust yourself. Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Clarity. Not certainty about the investment decision, but clarity about the process he needed to follow. Rachel, can I try something? Of course. Thomas took the legal pad and wrote at the top, Cryptocurrency Investment Decision. Under that, he wrote, Specific decision. Should I invest $15,000 in a diversified cryptocurrency portfolio over a 2-year time frame, with the goal of learning about digital assets while potentially growing my savings? He looked up at Rachel. Just writing that specific question feels different than should I invest in crypto? How so? It's concrete. I can actually research the answer to the specific question instead of researching everything about cryptocurrency in general. Rachel nodded. What else? Thomas continued writing. My priorities. Learn about new technology. Diversify investments beyond traditional stocks/bonds. Potential for growth. But not risking money I need for house down payment. Minimum criteria for good decision. Investment amount won't impact daily life. Chosen currencies have reasonable fundamentals. I understand the risks. I have clear criteria for when to sell. As he wrote, Thomas felt the mental fog that had plagued him for months beginning to clear. Instead of trying to optimize for perfect outcomes, he was defining what constituted a good decision process. This is completely different from how I've been approaching it, he said. How so? I've been trying to predict the future perfectly instead of making a good decision with current information. Rachel smiled. And how does that feel? Thomas took a deep breath, feeling lighter than he had in months. Manageable, like something I can actually do instead of an impossible puzzle to solve. He looked at the framework Rachel had outlined, then at his own specific decision definition. Rachel, I think I know what I want to do. Tell me? I want to invest $10,000 in 3 different cryptocurrencies, dollar cost average over 6 months to reduce timing risk, and set clear criteria for when to reassess. It's not the perfect investment strategy, but it meets my criteria for a good decision. Rachel's face lit up. How long did it take you to reach that conclusion? Thomas looked at his watch. About 20 minutes. And how does that feel compared to 6 months of research? Thomas laughed, feeling a combination of relief and mild embarrassment, like I've been solving the wrong problem for half a year. What do you mean? I thought the problem was, what's the perfect cryptocurrency investment strategy? But the real problem was, how do I make a good financial decision and then move on with my life? Rachel nodded. That's strategic thinking, Tom. Focusing on the right problem instead of just working harder on the wrong problem. Thomas closed his notebook, feeling a sense of completion that had eluded him for months. Rachel, thank you for being patient with me, for helping me see what I was doing, and for showing me a different way to think about decisions. You're welcome. But Tom, I want you to understand something important. What's that? This pattern, getting stuck in analysis paralysis, it's not just about this investment. I've watched you do this with smaller decisions too. Where to go on vacation, which car to buy, even which restaurant to choose for dinner. Thomas felt the truth of her observation. You're right. I do tend to overthink decisions. So maybe the real insight here isn't about cryptocurrency. Maybe it's about developing a different relationship with uncertainty and decision-making in general. Rachel pulled out her phone and showed him an article she had bookmarked. This talked about something called satisficing, setting criteria for good enough, and then choosing the first option that meets those criteria. Thomas read the title. The Strategic Mind, Learning When Good Enough is Good Enough. The article talks about how perfectionism in decision-making actually leads to worse outcomes, not better ones. People who try to optimize every choice end up less satisfied and more anxious than people who learn to satisfice. Thomas felt a profound shift in his thinking. For years, he had equated thorough analysis with good decision-making. But Rachel was helping him see that beyond a certain point, more analysis could actually be counterproductive. So strategic thinking isn't about analyzing everything perfectly, he said slowly. It's about analyzing the right thing sufficiently, then acting with confidence. Exactly. And recognizing that the goal isn't perfect outcomes. It's good decisions followed by learning from whatever happens. As they prepared for bed that night, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Peace of mind. Not because he had found a perfect investment strategy, but because he had found a framework for making good decisions without getting trapped in endless analysis. The next day, he would implement his cryptocurrency investment plan. But more importantly, he would begin practicing a new approach to decision-making, one that prioritized action over analysis, learning over perfection, and strategic thinking over endless research. For the first time in months, Thomas was excited about the future, not because he could predict it perfectly, but because he finally had confidence in his ability to navigate whatever uncertainty it might bring. Chapter 5, The Leadership Lens. Amanda Foster stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office on the 32nd floor of the Meridian Tower, watching the morning traffic weave through downtown Chicago's grid of streets. As Chief Operating Officer of Nexus Consulting, she commanded a view that reflected her position, elevated, encompassing, strategic. But this morning, the view felt more like a burden than a privilege. Behind her, spread across the polished conference table, lay the remnants of what should have been a straightforward quarterly planning meeting. Laptops still open to conflicting project timelines, coffee cups abandoned mid-sip, and a whiteboard covered in diagrams that looked more like abstract art than actionable strategy. The meeting had ended 40 minutes ago, but Amanda remained in the room, trying to process what had just occurred. For the first time in her 12-year career at Nexus, she had witnessed something that shook her confidence in her leadership abilities. A room full of intelligent, experienced professionals who couldn't agree on the most basic facts about their own organization. The conflict had started simply enough. David Kim, head of the technology division, had presented data showing that their client satisfaction scores had improved by 15% over the past quarter. Jennifer Martinez, who led customer success, had immediately challenged those numbers, claiming her data showed satisfaction had actually declined by 8%. Michael Thompson from finance had then presented revenue figures that seemed to contradict both perspectives. What followed was not a productive discussion about data interpretation, but something Amanda had never seen before in a senior leadership meeting: a complete breakdown in shared reality. Each department head had become increasingly entrenched in their own version of the truth, and no amount of additional data seemed to bridge the gaps. Amanda walked to the whiteboard where the remnants of their attempted solutions still lingered: competing organizational charts, overlapping project timelines, and priority lists that bore no resemblance to each other. She stared at the chaos, realizing that what she was looking at wasn't a problem with data or processes. It was a problem with thinking. A soft knock interrupted her contemplation. Dr. Margaret Blackwell, the organizational psychology consultant Nexus had recently hired to help with leadership development, stood in the doorway. "Amanda, do you have a few minutes? I observed some interesting dynamics in this morning's meeting." Amanda gestured toward the chairs around the conference table. "Please sit. I could use an outside perspective on what just happened." Dr. Blackwell settled into a chair and pulled out a simple notebook, a refreshing contrast to the digital chaos that had dominated the morning's discussion. "Amanda, can I ask you a question? What did you think the meeting was about?" The question caught Amanda off guard. "Quarterly planning, aligning our departments on priorities, and resource allocation for Q4. And what do you think your team members thought the meeting was about?" Amanda paused, realizing she had never considered this question. I assumed they understood the same way I did." Dr. Blackwell nodded. "That's a common assumption among leaders. But based on what I observed, I think each person came to that meeting with a different definition of success, different priorities, and different interpretations of the same information." She opened her notebook and showed Amanda a simple diagram she had sketched during the meeting. "David, technology success equals technical excellence, innovation metrics Jennifer. Customer success equals client retention and satisfaction Michael. Finance success equals revenue growth and cost control you. COO success equals organizational alignment and strategic execution." Amanda studied the diagram. "So you're saying we weren't really having one meeting? We were having 4 different meetings?" "Exactly. And when people are solving different problems, they naturally arrive at different solutions. The conflict wasn't really about data accuracy. It was about competing frameworks for understanding what the data means." Dr. Blackwell leaned forward. "Amanda, this is what I call the leadership lens problem. As leaders rise in organizations, they often focus on developing better decision-making skills, better strategic thinking, better communication. But they rarely develop the most critical leadership skill of all, which is the ability to recognize and align different thinking frameworks within their teams." Amanda felt something click into place. "You're saying the problem wasn't that my team can't think strategically. The problem was that they were all thinking strategically about different things." "Precisely. And when that happens, strategic thinking becomes a source of conflict rather than clarity." Dr. Blackwell stood and walked to the whiteboard. "Amanda, can I show you something?" She erased a section of the board and wrote, "Strategic Alignment Framework." Most leaders try to solve misalignment through better communication or clearer directives. But strategic alignment requires something deeper: shared frameworks for thinking about problems. She drew 3 circles that overlapped in the center. Circle 1, shared definition of the problem we're solving. Circle 2, shared criteria for evaluating solutions. Circle 3, shared understanding of success metrics. Amanda studied the diagram. "And you think this morning's meeting failed because we didn't have alignment in any of those areas? Let me ask you this. Before the meeting, did you explicitly define what problem you were asking the team to solve?" Amanda thought back to her meeting invitation. She had written, "Q4 planning, strategic priorities discussion." I thought it was obvious. We need to plan our priorities for the next quarter. But think about what that means to each department head. David might interpret strategic priorities as technology roadmap decisions. Jennifer might think it's about customer retention strategies. Michael might focus on financial optimization. Dr. Blackwell wrote on the board, "Same words, different meanings." This is what I call the vocabulary illusion, the belief that using the same words means everyone understands the same concepts. Amanda felt a profound shift in her thinking. So you're saying that leadership isn't just about making good decisions. It's about creating conditions where teams can think together effectively? That's exactly what I'm saying. And it requires what I call metastrategic thinking. Thinking about how your team thinks, not just what they think. Dr. Blackwell returned to her seat. Amanda, let me ask you another question. When David presented his customer satisfaction data and Jennifer challenged it, what was your first instinct? Amanda recalled the moment. I wanted to figure out who was right. I asked them to double-check their sources and methodology. And how did that work? It made things worse. Each of them came back with more data supporting their original position. Dr. Blackwell nodded. Because you were trying to solve a data problem when you actually had a framework problem. David and Jennifer weren't measuring different things badly. They were measuring different things well. She drew another diagram. David's satisfaction metric, technical performance and feature adoption. Jennifer's satisfaction metric, relationship quality and support responsiveness. They were both right within their own frameworks. The conflict arose because they were using the same word, satisfaction, to describe different concepts. Amanda leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of the realization. So how do I solve framework problems instead of just data problems? By becoming what I call a strategic facilitator, instead of just a strategic thinker. Instead of trying to think through problems for your team, you help your team think through problems together. Dr. Blackwell opened to a new page in her notebook. Let me show you what that looks like in practice. She wrote, Strategic Facilitation Process. Step 1. Define the specific problem you're asking the team to solve. Not quarterly planning, but something like, how do we prioritize 3 competing initiatives given our resource constraints? Step 2. Establish shared success criteria before discussing solutions. Ask, what would need to be true for us to consider this a successful planning session? Step 3. Surface and align different thinking frameworks. Ask each person, how are you thinking about this problem? What factors are you considering? What does success look like from your perspective? Step 4. Build shared criteria for evaluating options. Instead of debating solutions, first agree on how you'll evaluate solutions. Step 5. Generate and assess options using the shared criteria. Amanda studied the process. This is completely different from how I usually run strategic planning sessions. How do you usually run them? I present the strategic context, share my analysis of our situation, outline the key decisions we need to make, and then ask for input on implementation. Dr. Blackwell smiled. That's traditional leadership. You do the strategic thinking and ask others to execute. But strategic facilitation means you create conditions for the team to do strategic thinking together. What's the difference in outcomes? When you do the thinking for them, you get compliance and execution. When you facilitate thinking together, you get alignment and ownership. Amanda felt excited about trying this approach, but also nervous about giving up control of the strategic process. What if they come to the wrong conclusions? What if their collective thinking leads to poor decisions? That's the fear that keeps most leaders trapped in traditional approaches, Dr. Blackwell said. But think about what happened this morning. Your individual strategic thinking led to a session where nothing got decided and relationships were damaged. She paused to let that sink in. Strategic facilitation doesn't mean abandoning your strategic judgment. It means using your strategic thinking to design processes that leverage everyone's strategic thinking. Amanda walked back to the window, processing this new perspective. Below, the traffic continued its complex dance of individual decisions that somehow created collective movement. Dr. Blackwell, can I try something? Can we redesign this morning's meeting using your framework? Of course. Amanda returned to a whiteboard and wrote, Q4 planning session, take 2. Step 1, specific problem definition, she wrote. How do we allocate our limited resources across competing opportunities to maximize both client value and organizational growth in Q4? That's much clearer than strategic priorities discussion, Dr. Blackwell observed. Step 2, shared success criteria. Amanda continued writing. Successful session outcomes. clear resource allocation decisions, alignment on trade-offs, commitment to implementation plan, maintain team relationships. Step 3. Surface thinking frameworks. She wrote, ask each leader, how do you evaluate opportunities? What constitutes success in your area? What constraints should we consider? Step 4. Build shared evaluation criteria. Amanda was gaining momentum. Agree on weighted factors for decision-making, client impact, revenue potential, resource requirements, strategic alignment, risk level. Step 5. Generate and assess options using shared criteria. As she wrote, Amanda felt her understanding of leadership expanding. Instead of seeing her role as making strategic decisions for others to implement, she was beginning to see it as designing strategic thinking processes that the team could execute together. This feels like a completely different job, she said. How so? Instead of being the smartest person in the room, I need to be the person who helps the room think most effectively. Dr. Blackwell nodded. That's the evolution from individual strategic thinking to collective strategic thinking, and it's essential for leading complex organizations. Amanda's phone buzzed with calendar reminder. Leadership team follow-up meeting, 3 p.m. She looked at Dr. Blackwell. I scheduled a follow-up meeting to try to resolve this morning's issues. Would you be willing to help me facilitate it using this new approach? I'd be happy to observe and provide feedback. But Amanda, I think you should facilitate it yourself. You understand the business context better than I do. What if I mess it up? Then you'll learn something valuable about strategic facilitation. Remember, the goal isn't to execute this perfectly. It's to practice a different approach to leadership. At 3 p.m., Amanda's leadership team reconvened in the same conference room. But this time, instead of sitting at the head of the table with her laptop open, Amanda stood at the whiteboard with a marker in hand. Before we begin, she said, I want to acknowledge that this morning's meeting didn't go as well as any of us hoped. I think the problem wasn't with our individual thinking, but with how we were thinking together. She gestured toward the whiteboard, which now contained the strategic facilitation framework she had developed with Dr. Blackwell. I want to try a different approach. Instead of me presenting my analysis and asking for your input, I want us to think through this problem together, step by step. David Kim raised his hand. Amanda, are you saying you don't have a strategic direction in mind? I have perspectives and opinions, just like all of you, but I'm realizing that the best strategic decisions come from combining all of our perspectives, not just implementing mine. She wrote on the board, Problem: how we allocate our limited resources across competing opportunities to maximize both client value and organizational growth in Q4. David, Jennifer, Michael, does this capture the decision we need to make, or should we refine it further? Jennifer Martinez spoke up. I think we also need to consider team capacity and morale. We've been pushing hard for 3 quarters. Good point. Amanda added sustainable team capacity to the problem statement. What else should be included in our problem definition? For the next 10 minutes, they refined the problem statement until everyone agreed it captured the real decision they needed to make. Now, Amanda said, before we discuss solutions, let's align on what would constitute a successful planning session. What would need to happen for each of you to leave here feeling good about our process and outcomes? Michael Thompson said, I need to understand the financial implications of our choices and feel confident we're making sustainable decisions. Jennifer added, I need to know that client relationships won't be damaged by our resource allocation. David said, I want to make sure we're not sacrificing long-term technical excellence for short-term gains. Amanda wrote each criterion on the board, then asked, what would I need to feel successful? She thought for a moment. I need to know that we're aligned on our decisions and that each of you feels ownership of the outcomes. Perfect, she said. Now let's talk about how each of you typically evaluates opportunities and resource allocation decisions. What followed was a different kind of conversation than they had ever had as a leadership team. Instead of debating specific decisions, they explored their underlying thinking frameworks. David talked about technical debt and innovation cycles. Jennifer discussed client lifecycle management and relationship investment. Michael explained financial modeling and risk assessment. For the first time, Amanda saw how their different perspectives could complement rather than compete with each other. "This is fascinating," David said. "I never realized that when Jennifer talks about client investment, she's thinking about a completely different time frame than when I talk about technical investment." "Exactly," Amanda replied. "And now that we understand each other's frameworks, we can build criteria that incorporate all of our perspectives." The remainder of the meeting proceeded smoothly. They established weighted criteria for evaluating opportunities, assessed their options using those criteria, and reached decisions that everyone felt good about implementing. As the team filed out of the conference room, Jennifer approached Amanda. "That was the most productive strategic planning session we've ever had. What changed?" Amanda looked at the whiteboard, still covered with the collaborative thinking process they had just completed. "I realized that my job isn't to be the strategic thinker for the team. My job is to help the team think strategically together." "And how does that feel different?" Amanda considered the question. "It feels like leadership instead of management, like building something together instead of executing someone else's vision." Dr. Blackwell, who had observed from the back of the room, approached as Jennifer left. "How was that experience for you?" "Completely different from anything I've done before. Instead of feeling like I had to have all the answers, I felt like I was helping us find the answers together." "And what did you learn?" Amanda walked to the whiteboard and studied the framework they had created together. "I learned that strategic thinking isn't just an individual skill. It's a collective capability. And building that capability requires a different kind of leadership than I was taught." She paused, reflecting on the shift in her thinking. "I also learned that the best strategic decisions come not from the smartest person in the room, but from a room thinking smartly together." Dr. Blackwell smiled. "Amanda, you've just discovered the difference between being a strategic leader and being a leader who enables strategic thinking. What's next? How do I continue developing this capability?" "Practice. Start facilitating strategic thinking in smaller decisions. Pay attention to when your team is having data problems versus framework problems. And remember, your job isn't to eliminate different perspectives, but to help those perspectives combine into better decisions." As Amanda prepared to leave the office that evening, she reflected on the transformation in her understanding of leadership. She had always believed that strategic thinking was her individual responsibility as a leader, but now she was beginning to see it as a collective capability that she could help develop and facilitate. The view from her office window looked the same, but her perspective on leadership and on the role of strategic thinking in organizations had fundamentally changed. Instead of seeing herself as a strategic thinker, she was becoming the person who helped others think strategically together. And that, she realized, was a much more powerful form of leadership than anything she had practiced before. Chapter 6. The Mirror of Assumptions. Rebecca Chin sat in her car in the parking lot of Riverside Community Center, staring at the building that housed the divorce mediation office, where she would spend the next 2 hours attempting to divide 15 years of shared life into neat legal categories. The October rain drummed against her windshield, creating distorted patterns that seemed to mirror confusion in her mind about how her marriage to David had unraveled so completely. 6 months earlier, she and David had been planning their daughter Sophie's Sweet 16 party and discussing vacation destinations for their upcoming anniversary. Now they were communicating primarily through lawyers and sitting in separate cars in the same parking lot, each convinced that the other person had fundamentally changed into someone unrecognizable. Rebecca checked her phone. 2:27 p.m. The mediation session was scheduled to start at 2:30. Through her passenger window, she could see David in his silver Honda, probably reviewing notes on his tablet the same way he approached every important meeting. Even in crisis, his systematic nature persisted, one of the qualities that had initially attracted her to him during their graduate school days. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Linda. "How are you holding up? Remember what we talked about. Stay focused on the facts. Don't let emotions take over." Rebecca stared at the message, feeling the weight of the advice. For months, everyone had been telling her to be logical, to focus on the facts, to think rationally about the divorce. But the more she tried to approach the situation analytically, the more confused and frustrated she became. The truth was, She couldn't identify any clear facts about what had gone wrong. There had been no affair, no financial crisis, no dramatic betrayal. Instead, there had been a gradual erosion of connection that neither of them seemed able to explain or reverse. They had simply become two people living parallel lives in the same house, each convinced that the other had stopped caring. Rebecca gathered her courage and walked through the rain toward the building. In the waiting area, she found David already seated, reviewing a folder of documents. He looked up when she entered, offering a polite nod that felt like a handshake between strangers. "Rebecca," he said quietly. "David." They sat in silence until Catherine Walsh, their mediator, emerged from her office. Catherine was a family therapist who specialized in collaborative divorce, and something about her calm presence had made both Rebecca and David feel like their situation might be resolvable through rational discussion. "Rebecca, David, thank you for being here. Let's go ahead and get started." Catherine's office was designed to feel more like a living room than a legal setting, with comfortable chairs arranged around a low table instead of the formal conference setup Rebecca had expected. "Before we dive into the practical matters," Catherine said, settling into her chair, "I'd like to try something a little different today. I've been thinking about our previous sessions, and I notice that both of you are approaching this divorce as if it's a logical problem to be solved. But I'm wondering if we might be missing something important." Rebecca felt a flicker of interest. "What do you mean?" "Well, you're both intelligent, thoughtful people who have successfully navigated complex challenges throughout your marriage. You've made good decisions about careers, parenting, finances. But when it comes to understanding why your marriage deteriorated, you both seem genuinely puzzled." David shifted in his chair. "Catherine, we've talked about this extensively. We simply grew apart. People change." "That's the conclusion you've reached," Catherine said gently. "But I'm curious about the process that led to that conclusion. Can I ask you both to try something?" She pulled out 2 sheets of paper and handed one to each of them. "I want you each to write down the story of how your marriage ended. Not the legal facts or the timeline of events, but your understanding of what really happened. Take about 10 minutes." Rebecca looked at the blank paper, unsure where to begin. She had told this story dozens of times to friends, family, and therapists, but something about Catherine's request felt different. She began writing. "David gradually became more focused on his work and less interested in our relationship. He stopped making effort to connect with me emotionally. When I tried to talk to him about problems, he would get defensive or suggest practical solutions instead of listening to how I felt. Over time, I felt like I was living with a roommate instead of a partner." David was writing steadily on his sheet, occasionally pausing to think. After 10 minutes, Catherine asked him to stop. "Now," she said, "I want you to do something that might feel uncomfortable. I want you to write the same story, but from the other person's perspective. Rebecca, write David's version of what happened. David, write Rebecca's version." Rebecca felt resistance to the exercise. "Catherine, I don't think I can speak for David's experience." "I'm not asking you to be accurate," Catherine replied. "I'm asking you to try to understand how the situation might look from his perspective." Reluctantly, Rebecca began writing again. Rebecca became increasingly critical and emotionally demanding. "No matter how hard I worked to provide for our family, she was never satisfied. She would create conflict over small issues and then get upset when I tried to solve the problems rationally. I felt like nothing I did was ever good enough." When they finished, Catherine asked them to read their original stories aloud. Rebecca read hers first, describing David's withdrawal and emotional unavailability. David then read his version, describing Rebecca's increasing criticism and unreasonable expectations. "Now," Catherine said, "read the stories you wrote from each other's perspectives." As Rebecca read her attempt to capture David's experience, she felt something shift in her understanding. The words she had written described a person who felt constantly criticized and never appreciated, emotions she could relate to, even though she had never considered that David might be experiencing them. David's reading of Rebecca's perspective showed a similar pattern. He described feelings of loneliness and emotional neglect that, despite his analytical nature, he seemed to genuinely recognize. "What do you notice?" Catherine asked. Rebecca spoke first. Both stories could be true at the same time. David nodded slowly. It's like we were having two different experiences of the same marriage. Exactly, Catherine said. And here's what I find interesting. In your original stories, you each position yourselves as responding to the other person's behavior. But when you try to see from the other perspective, you could recognize the emotions driving those behaviors. She leaned forward. Rebecca, in your original story, David withdrew because he became selfish or uncaring. But in the story you wrote from his perspective, he withdrew because he felt criticized and unappreciated. Rebecca felt the truth of this observation. So his withdrawal wasn't about not caring. It was about feeling like his caring wasn't recognized. What do you think? Rebecca looked at David, really seeing him for the first time in months. David, is that how you felt? Like I didn't appreciate your efforts? David's composure cracked slightly. Rebecca, I worked 12-hour days to make sure you and Sophie had everything you needed. I took care of the house maintenance, the finances, the insurance, the college planning. But every conversation we had seemed to be about what I wasn't doing right. But David, I wasn't criticizing your practical contributions. I was trying to tell you that I miss feeling connected to you emotionally. But every time you brought up emotions, it felt like an accusation that I was failing as a husband. Catherine intervened gently. What you're both describing is what I call the assumption trap. You each made assumptions about the other person's motivations based on your own experience of their behavior. She drew a simple diagram on a piece of paper. Rebecca's experience. David withdraws. He must not care about me, David's experience. Rebecca criticizes. She must not appreciate me. But what if David withdraws? He feels unappreciated. Rebecca criticizes. She feels disconnected. Rebecca studied the diagram, feeling pieces of a puzzle falling into place. Catherine, are you saying that we created a cycle where each of us was responding to our own assumptions about the other person's motivations? What do you think? Rebecca looked back at David. When you would suggest practical solutions to emotional problems, I assumed you weren't taking my feelings seriously. But maybe you were trying to help in a way that made sense to you. David nodded. And when you would bring up relationship issues, I assumed you were saying I was failing. But maybe you were just trying to connect. This is what strategic thinking looks like in relationships, Catherine said. Instead of reacting to behavior, you examine the assumptions driving your reactions. She pulled out another sheet of paper. Let me show you something called the ladder of inference. It's a tool for understanding how we move from observable facts to conclusions. She drew a ladder with several rungs. Top, actions based on beliefs about the world, conclusions drawn, assumptions made, meanings added, data selected. Bottom, observable facts. Here's how it works, Catherine explained. We observe facts. David comes home and goes straight to his computer. Rebecca mentions feeling disconnected. But we don't stop at facts. We immediately start climbing a ladder. She pointed to the second rung. We select certain data to pay attention to. Rebecca notices that David didn't ask about her day. David notices that Rebecca sounds frustrated. Then we add meaning. Rebecca thinks, he doesn't care about my day. David thinks, she's unhappy with me again. Then we make assumptions. Rebecca assumes David's priorities have changed. David assumes Rebecca's expectations are unrealistic. Then we draw conclusions. Rebecca concludes that David doesn't value their relationship. David concludes that Rebecca is impossible to please. And finally, we act based on those conclusions. Rebecca withdraws emotionally. David works longer hours to avoid conflict. Rebecca felt a shock of recognition. That's exactly what happened. But we were both acting on assumptions, not facts. David was studying the ladder intently. Catherine, how do we break the cycle? By learning to distinguish between facts and interpretations, and by getting curious about each other's assumptions instead of defending against them. Catherine turned to a fresh page. Let me show you what strategic thinking looks like in relationships. Instead of assuming you understand each other's motivations, you investigate them. She wrote, strategic relationship questions. What did I observe? Facts only. What story am I telling myself about what I observed? What assumptions am I making? What other explanations are possible? What would I need to learn to understand the situation better? Rebecca, Let's practice with a specific example. Can you think of a recent interaction with David that felt disappointing? Rebecca thought for a moment. Last week, I mentioned that I was stressed about Sophie's college applications. David immediately started talking about application deadlines and financial aid forms. Perfect. Let's walk through the strategic questions. What did you observe? I said I was stressed about college applications. David responded by discussing practical aspects of the application process. What story did you tell yourself about what you observed? Rebecca hesitated. That he wasn't listening to my emotions, that he was trying to fix instead of understand. What assumptions were you making? That when I say I'm stressed, he should respond with emotional support, not practical advice. What other explanations are possible? Rebecca looked at David, seeing him differently than she had in months. That he was trying to help reduce my stress by addressing practical issues? David's eyes brightened. Rebecca, that's exactly what I was doing. When you said you were stressed, I thought the best way to help was to make the process more manageable. And what would you need to learn to understand the situation better? Catherine prompted. How David shows care and support, even if it's different from how I show care and support. Catherine turned to David. Your turn. How did you experience that same conversation? I heard Rebecca say she was stressed, and I wanted to help. I thought if I could break down the application process into manageable steps, it would reduce her anxiety. What story did you tell yourself when Rebecca seemed frustrated with your response? David was quiet for a moment. That she didn't want practical help, that she just wanted to complain about problems without solving them. What assumptions were you making? That emotional support means just listening without offering solutions, and that if someone brings up a problem, they want help fixing it. What other explanations are possible? David looked at Rebecca. That emotional support and practical support are both ways of caring, and sometimes people need one more than the other. Rebecca felt tears welling up in her eyes. David, I do want your help, but sometimes I need to feel understood before I can focus on solutions. And Rebecca, David said, when I offer practical help, it's because I care about reducing your stress, not because I don't want to hear your feelings. Catherine smiled. What you're both discovering is that your assumptions about each other's motivations were creating the very problems you were trying to solve. She drew another diagram. Assumption cycle versus curiosity cycle. Assumption cycle, behavior assumption about motivation, defensive reaction, confirms original assumption. Curiosity cycle, behavior question about motivation, investigation, and dialogue, understanding, and connection. Rebecca studied the diagrams, feeling hope for the first time in months. Catherine, does this mean our problems were really just misunderstandings? Not exactly, Catherine replied carefully. Your problems were real. You were both experiencing genuine frustration and disconnection. But the causes of those problems may have been different from what you assumed. She leaned back in her chair. The question is, now that you understand each other's motivations differently, what do you want to do with that understanding? Rebecca looked at David, seeing not the distant, uncaring person she had been divorcing, but the anxious, well-intentioned person she had fallen in love with 15 years earlier. David, would you be willing to try working on this? Not the divorce, the marriage. David was quiet for a long moment. Rebecca, I've missed you. I've missed us. If you're willing to try a different approach to solving problems together, so am I. Catherine nodded. What you're both demonstrating is the most important principle of strategic thinking in relationships, the willingness to question your own assumptions and get curious about each other's experience. As they prepared to leave that day, Rebecca reflected on how dramatically her understanding had shifted in just 2 hours. The facts about her marriage hadn't changed, but her interpretation of those facts had been completely transformed. Walking to the parking lot with David, together, for the first time in months, she realized that strategic thinking in relationships wasn't about being more logical or rational. It was about being more curious, more humble, and more willing to question the stories she told herself about other people's motivations. The rain had stopped, and late afternoon sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds. Rebecca looked at David and saw not a stranger who had disappointed her, but a partner whose way of caring had become invisible to her because it was different from her own. They had a long way to go to rebuild their relationship, But for the first time in months, Rebecca believed they were walking in the same direction. Chapter 7. The Way to Choice. Marcus Williams stood at the edge of Golden Gate Park, watching the early morning fog roll across the San Francisco skyline like a slow-motion avalanche. His running shoes crunched against the gravel path as he paused to catch his breath, not from physical exertion, but from the weight of the decision that had been consuming his thoughts for the past 3 months. At 34, Marcus had built what most people would consider a successful life. As a senior software engineer at one of Silicon Valley's most prestigious tech companies, he earned more than he had ever imagined possible growing up in Detroit. His apartment in Soma had a view of the bay. His 401k was growing steadily, and his colleagues respected his technical expertise. But success, Marcus was discovering, could be its own kind of prison. 3 months earlier, his former college roommate Jake had called with an opportunity that had turned Marcus's carefully planned life upside down. Jake was launching a startup focused on educational technology for underserved communities, exactly the kind of work Marcus had dreamed of doing when he first learned to code as a teenager in an after-school program. The opportunity was everything Marcus claimed to want: meaningful work, the chance to make a real difference, and the possibility of building something from the ground up. It was also everything he feared: uncertain income, no guaranteed health insurance, and the very real possibility of failure. Marcus resumed his run, trying to process the conversation he'd had with his therapist, Dr. Lisa Park, the previous day. Dr. Park had introduced him to something called values clarification, a process of identifying what truly mattered to him beneath the surface of his daily decisions. Marcus, she had said, you keep framing this as a choice between security and risk. But what if it's actually a choice between different kinds of values? As he ran through the park, Marcus replayed their conversation. Dr. Park had asked him to complete what seemed like a simple exercise, listing his core values in order of importance. What had emerged was more complex than he had expected. At the top of his list, making a positive impact on others, especially young people who lacked opportunities. Second, financial security and stability for himself and his family. Third, intellectual challenge and growth. Fourth, autonomy and creative freedom. Fifth, work-life balance and time for relationships. The exercise had revealed a fundamental tension in his current situation. His high-paying tech job provided excellent financial security, but limited positive impact. Jake's startup offered maximum impact potential, but minimal financial security. Traditional decision-making frameworks, Dr. Park had explained, focus on pros and cons, costs and benefits. But strategic thinking about life choices requires something deeper, understanding how different options align with your core values, and more importantly, how those values interact with each other. Marcus stopped running and sat on a bench overlooking the city. He pulled out his phone and opened the Notes app where he had been working through what Dr. Park called the values integration process. Instead of simply choosing between security and impact, she had challenged him to think strategically about how to honor multiple values simultaneously. It wasn't about finding the perfect choice, but about making the choice that best integrated his various priorities. Dr. Park had introduced him to a framework she called strategic life design, values clarification, what matters most to you, context analysis, what's your current life situation, option generation, what choices are actually available, integration assessment, how well does each option honor your complete value system, implementation strategy, how do you maximize the benefits and minimize the cost of your choice. Marcus opened his notebook and reviewed the analysis he had been working on. Current context: 34 years old, single, no dependents, $180,000 salary, substantial savings. Parents aging, may need financial support. Strong technical skills, good professional reputation. Feeling increasingly disconnected from meaningful work. Option A, stay at current job. Values honored. Financial security high. Stability high. Values compromised. Impact low. Growth medium. Autonomy low. Option B, join Jake's startup. Values honored. Impact high. Growth high. Autonomy high. Values compromised. Financial security low. Stability low. Option C. Dr. Park had pushed him to consider whether he was artificially limiting his choices by seeing only two options. Marcus, she had said, strategic thinking often reveals options that weren't initially visible. What would a third alternative look like? That question had been haunting him for a week. Was there a way to honor both his need for impact and his need for security? Were there creative approaches he hadn't considered? His phone buzzed with a text from Jake. Marcus, I know you're still thinking this through. No pressure, but our funding round closes next week. If you're interested, I need to know by Friday. Friday, 3 days away. Marcus felt a familiar anxiety that came with deadline pressure. But this time he tried to apply something Dr. Park had taught him about strategic decision-making under pressure. When you feel pressure to decide quickly, she had said, that's usually a signal to slow down and think more strategically, not less. Pressure often comes from artificial urgency or from trying to make a perfect decision rather than a good one. Marcus considered Jake's timeline. The funding round deadline was real, but was it the only deadline that mattered? What if Marcus took the time to explore a third option, even if it meant missing this particular opportunity? He opened his phone and called his sister Nina, who worked as a nonprofit consultant in Chicago. Nina, can I run something by you? I'm trying to think through this career decision, and I feel like I'm missing something. Of course. What's going on? Marcus explained the situation, the startup opportunity, his current job dissatisfaction, his values conflict, and the Friday deadline. Marcus, Nina said after listening to the full story, can I ask you something? Why do you think these are your only two options? What do you mean? I mean, you're talking about this like you have to choose between Jake's startup or your current job. But you're a senior engineer with great skills and strong values. Aren't there other ways to combine impact and security? Marcus felt something shift in his thinking, such as, well, what about working for an established company that has a social mission? Or consulting part-time for nonprofits while maintaining some corporate income? Or starting your own company with a different risk profile? Or, Nina continued, what about negotiating with your current company to work on more impactful projects? Some companies have volunteer programs or social responsibility initiatives. Marcus realized he had been thinking in binary terms, startup versus corporate job, when the reality was much more nuanced. Nina, that's exactly what I needed to hear. I think I've been trapped in either or thinking when I should be looking for both and solutions. After ending the call, Marcus walked to a coffee shop and opened his laptop. Instead of continuing to agonize over the two options he had been considering, he began researching what Nina had suggested. What he discovered surprised him. There were dozens of established technology companies working on educational and social impact projects. There were consulting opportunities that would allow him to maintain some financial stability while building experience in the nonprofit sector. There were even fellowship programs that provided stipends for experienced professionals to work with social organizations. Most intriguingly, he found several examples of people who had created hybrid career paths, working part-time for stable companies while building social impact ventures on the side. Marcus began drafting what he called his strategic career plan. Phase 1, next 6 months, negotiate with current employer to work on pro bono projects for educational nonprofits. Build experience and network in the sector while maintaining salary. Phase 2, 6 to 18 months transition to part-time consulting for corporate clients while taking on paid projects with social organizations. Test his interest and aptitude for nonprofit work while reducing but not eliminating stable income. Phase 3, 18 to 36 months based on learnings from phases 1 and 2. Decide whether to fully transition to nonprofit work, start his own social venture, or create a permanent hybrid model. As he typed, Marcus felt excitement building for the first time in months. Instead of choosing between security and impact, he was designing a path that could provide both, albeit with different trade-offs at different stages. He called Dr. Park's office and scheduled an emergency session for that afternoon. Dr. Park, he said when he arrived at her office, I think I've been asking the wrong question. Tell me more. I've been asking, should I take the startup job or keep my corporate job? But the strategic question is, how do I design a career path that honors all of my values over time? Dr. Park smiled. That's exactly the kind of insight that comes from moving beyond binary thinking. What did you discover? Marcus shared his three-phase plan, explaining how each phase would allow him to test his assumptions about nonprofit work while gradually reducing his financial risk. The beautiful thing about this approach, he said, is that it turns a high-stakes decision into a series of smaller experiments. Instead of betting everything on one choice, I'm creating options for myself. Dr. Park nodded. This is what strategic life design looks like. Instead of making irreversible choices based on incomplete information, you're creating reversible experiments that generate the information you need for future choices. But Dr. Park, I still have to respond to Jake by Friday. How do I handle that? What feels right to you? Marcus thought for a moment. I think I need to tell Jake that I'm not ready to commit to a startup right now, but that I'm designing a path that might lead me to similar work in the future. Maybe we can stay connected. And how does that feel? Scary, because I'm giving up a concrete opportunity, but also relieving, because I'm not forcing myself into a choice I'm not ready for. Dr. Park leaned forward. Marcus, what you're describing is what I call strategic patience, the ability to wait for better options instead of settling for available options. But what if I miss out? What if Jake's startup becomes the next big thing? That's always possible. But what if forcing yourself into a decision you're not ready for leads to an outcome that satisfies none of your values? Strategic thinking isn't about avoiding all risks. It's about taking smart risks when you're prepared for them. Marcus felt a deep sense of relief settling over him. For 3 months, he had been torturing himself with an artificial choice between two imperfect options. Now, he was beginning to see that the real choice was about how to design a life that honored his complete value system. That evening, Marcus called Jake. Jake, I've been thinking a lot about your offer, and I need to be honest with you. I'm listening. I'm not ready to make the jump to a startup right now. I need to gain more experience in the social sector and test my commitment to this kind of work before making such a significant transition. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Marcus felt his heart racing, knowing he was closing a door that might not open again. You know what, Marcus? Jake said, finally. I respect that. It takes courage to know when you're not ready for something, even when it looks like a great opportunity. I hope we can stay connected. I'm designing a career path that I think will lead me toward this kind of work, just on a different timeline. Absolutely. And Marcus, when you are ready for something like this, give me a call. The sector needs people who think strategically about their own development. After ending the call, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Peace with uncertainty. He didn't know exactly where his career path would lead, but he had confidence in his process for navigating it. He opened his journal and wrote, Today I learned that strategic thinking about life choices isn't about making perfect decisions. It's about designing good processes for making decisions. Instead of trying to predict the future, I'm creating flexibility to respond to whatever future emerges. The question isn't what's the right choice. The question is, how do I make choices that honor my values while keeping options open for continued growth and learning? Marcus closed his journal and looked out his window at the San Francisco skyline. The fog had lifted, revealing a clear view of the bay and the mountains beyond. The metaphor wasn't lost on him. Sometimes clarity came not from making decisions, but from stepping back far enough to see the bigger picture. He had 3 days to respond to Jake's offer, but he no longer felt the weight of that deadline. He had already made the most important decision, to trust his own strategic thinking process rather than rushing into choices he wasn't ready for. For the first time in months, Marcus felt excited about his future, not because he knew what it would look like, but because he trusted his ability to navigate whatever choices emerge along the way. Chapter 8. The Feedback Loop. Dr. Jennifer Wall stood at the podium in the main auditorium of Riverside University Medical School, looking out at 200 first-year medical students who were about to receive their first major examination results. As Director of Medical Education, she had delivered this type of feedback session dozens of times. But today felt different. Today, she was going to try something that challenged everything she had been taught about performance evaluation and improvement. The traditional approach was straightforward. Return the exams, review the correct answers, identify common mistakes, and encourage students to study harder for the next test. It was efficient, systematic, and completely ineffective at helping students develop the kind of thinking skills they would need as physicians. 3 weeks earlier, Dr. Walsh had attended a conference where Dr. Carol Dweck presented research on growth mindset and feedback effectiveness. The findings have been troubling. Traditional performance feedback often reinforced fixed mindset thinking and actually hindered learning rather than promoting it. More importantly, Dr. Dweck had introduced something called process-focused feedback, an approach that helped people improve their thinking and learning strategies rather than just their performance outcomes. Students, Dr. Walsh began, before I return your examination results, I want to try something different today. Instead of focusing primarily on what you got wrong, we're going to focus on how you can think more effectively about complex medical problems. She noticed puzzled expressions throughout the auditorium. Students were accustomed to receiving their scores, identifying their weaknesses, and moving on to the next test. How many of you have heard the phrase, failure is the best teacher? Dr. Walsh asked. Most hands went up. That phrase is only half true. Failure can be an excellent teacher, but only if you know how to learn from it strategically. Most people, when they fail or perform poorly, focus on what they did wrong, but strategic learners focus on how they thought about the problem. Dr. Walsh moved away from the podium and walked closer to the students. Let me share something with you. This examination was designed not just to test your knowledge, but to reveal patterns in your thinking. The questions were carefully constructed to identify common cognitive traps that even experienced physicians fall into. She clicked to her first slide, Strategic Learning versus Performance Learning. Performance learning asks, what did I get wrong? Strategic learning asks, how was I thinking about this problem? Performance learning focuses on knowledge gaps. Strategic learning focuses on thinking gaps. Performance learning seeks to avoid future mistakes. Strategic learning seeks to improve future thinking. A student in the third row raised her hand. Dr. Walsh, is it important to know what we got wrong so we can learn the correct information? Excellent question, Sarah. Of course, accuracy matters. But here's what I've discovered in 20 years of medical education. Students who focus primarily on getting the right answers often struggle when they encounter problems that don't have clear right answers. Dr. Walsh clicked to the next slide, showing a complex patient case. In clinical practice, you'll face situations where multiple treatment approaches could be reasonable, where diagnostic tests are inconclusive, where patient preferences conflict with medical recommendations. In those situations, your ability to think through uncertainty becomes more important than your ability to recall facts. She looked around the room. So today, instead of just reviewing correct answers, we're going to analyze thinking processes. I'm going to show you 3 students' approaches to the same question, not their final answers, but their reasoning. Dr. Walsh displayed a complex clinical scenario on the screen. 68-year-old male presents with chest pain, shortness of breath, and elevated cardiac enzymes. History includes diabetes, hypertension, and smoking. What is your diagnostic approach? Here are 3 different thinking approaches from your classmates. I've removed names and changed details to protect privacy. Student A's approach: elevated cardiac enzymes plus chest pain equals heart attack. Given risk factors, recommend immediate cardiac catheterization. Student B's approach: multiple possibilities, acute coronary syndrome, pulmonary embolism, aortic dissection. Need to systematically rule out life-threatening conditions before settling on diagnosis. Student C's approach: this presentation suggests ACS, but the combination of symptoms could indicate several conditions. I need to consider: what questions would help me distinguish between possibilities? What additional information would change my approach? What are the consequences of being wrong about each potential diagnosis? Dr. Walsh let the students study the 3 approaches. Which student do you think performed best on this question? Several students called out Student C. Interestingly, student A got the question right. The patient did have a heart attack. Student C's answer was marked as incomplete because they didn't commit to a specific diagnosis. The auditorium was quiet, but if this were a real patient, which approach would serve them best? The silence stretched until a student near the back spoke up. Student C, because they were thinking about uncertainty and consequences, not just pattern recognition. Exactly. Student A used what psychologists call fast thinking, rapid pattern matching based on obvious cues. It worked in this case, but it's the same thinking that leads to misdiagnoses when cases don't fit typical patterns. Dr. Walsh clicked to a new slide, the Strategic Learning Framework. Today, I want to teach you how to extract strategic insights from your performance, whether that performance was good or bad. She outlined 5 questions on the screen. 1. What was my thinking process? 2. What assumptions did I make? 3. What information did I prioritize or ignore? 4. How did I handle uncertainty? 5. What would I do differently with similar problems? Let's practice this together. I'm going to show you a question that 70% of you answered incorrectly, and we're going to analyze not just the right answer, but the thinking that leads to right answers. The question appeared on screen. A 45-year-old female presents with fatigue, weight gain, and depression. TSH is elevated, but other thyroid function tests are normal. What is the most likely diagnosis? How many of you immediately thought hypothyroidism? Most hands went up. And how many of you selected that as your answer? About half the hands remained raised. Interesting. So some of you had the right initial thought, but then changed your answer. Let's examine both thinking processes. Dr. Walsh walked to the whiteboard. Those of you who stuck with hypothyroidism, what was your reasoning? A student called out, elevated TSH plus classic symptoms equals hypothyroidism. That's pattern recognition thinking. Fast, efficient, and often correct. But what might be problematic about that approach? Another student responded, it doesn't consider other possibilities or examine why other thyroid tests were normal. Exactly. Now, those of you who changed your answer, what made you second-guess yourselves? The phrase, other thyroid function tests are normal, made me think it couldn't be straightforward hypothyroidism. Dr. Walsh nodded. That's more nuanced thinking, but it led many of you to overthink a relatively straightforward case. The correct answer was indeed hypothyroidism, specifically subclinical hypothyroidism, where TSH is elevated but T3 and T4 are still normal. She turned back to the students. Here's a strategic insight. Both thinking approaches had value. Fast pattern recognition identified the most likely diagnosis. Slower, more analytical thinking caught the nuance in the question. The most effective physicians learn to combine both approaches. Dr. Walsh clicked to her next slide. Calibrating your thinking. This is what I call metacognitive awareness. Thinking about how you think. It's the skill that separates good physicians from great ones. She outlined a process. When you encounter a clinical problem, notice your first intuitive response. Ask, what pattern am I recognizing? Consider, what am I potentially missing? Decide, does this situation require fast thinking, slow thinking, or both? After the decision, reflect on the accuracy of your thinking process. A student in the front row raised her hand. Dr. Walsh, this seems like it would slow down decision-making. In emergency situations, don't we need to act quickly? Outstanding question, Michael. You're touching on one of the most important skills in medicine, knowing when to think fast and when to think slow. Dr. Walsh pulled up a new slide showing 2 scenarios. Scenario 1, patient in cardiac arrest appropriate thinking. Fast, protocol-driven, immediate action. Scenario 2, patient with vague symptoms, unclear history appropriate thinking. Slow, analytical, systematic consideration of possibilities. The strategic insight is that expert physicians don't just think fast or slow. They think at the right speed for the situation. And they know how to switch between thinking modes as circumstances change. She paused, looking around the room. Now, let's apply this to your examination performance. I want you to do something that might feel uncomfortable. I want you to analyze your own thinking process on 3 questions you got wrong. Dr. Walsh distributed a worksheet with the strategic learning questions she had outlined earlier. Choose 3 questions you answered incorrectly. For each one, work through the 5 strategic learning questions. Don't focus on the right answer. Focus on how you were thinking about the problem. As students worked through the exercise, Dr. Walsh walked among them, observing their analysis. After 15 minutes, she called for attention. What did you discover about your own thinking patterns? Sarah Martinez raised her hand. I realized I tend to jump to conclusions without considering alternative explanations. I was using pattern recognition when I should have been using systematic analysis. How might you adjust your approach for future problems? I think I need to force myself to generate at least 2 possible explanations before committing to one. Another student, David Chun, spoke up. I discovered the opposite problem. I was overthinking straightforward cases and missing obvious diagnoses because I was looking for complexity that wasn't there. And what's your insight for improvement? Maybe I need to trust my initial pattern recognition more, especially for classic presentations. Dr. Walsh smiled. This is exactly what strategic learning looks like. Instead of just knowing that you performed poorly, you're understanding how you were thinking and how you might think differently. She returned to the front of the room. Let me share something that might surprise you. The students who performed best on this examination weren't necessarily those who knew the most facts. They were the students who had the most accurate understanding of their own thinking processes. She clicked to a new slide showing anonymous performance data. Students who could accurately predict which questions they got wrong. 85% overall accuracy students who were surprised by their mistakes. 65% overall accuracy. This is called metacognitive accuracy. Knowing what you know and what you don't know. It's one of the strongest predictors of clinical competence. A student near the back called out, "How do we develop better metacognitive accuracy?" Practice exactly what we're doing today. Regularly analyzing not just your performance, but your thinking process. Medicine is one of the few fields where your thinking process can be literally a matter of life and death. Dr. Walsh moved to her final slide, building a strategic learning practice. I want to challenge you to make this a regular habit. After every exam, every clinical encounter, every challenging case, analyze your thinking process. Identify patterns in your cognitive strengths and weaknesses. Practice specific thinking skills you want to improve. Seek feedback on your reasoning, not just your conclusions. Celebrate improvements in thinking, not just improvements in scores. She looked around the room one more time. Remember, you're not just learning to be physicians who know the right answers. You're learning to be physicians who can think clearly under pressure, handle uncertainty with wisdom, and continue learning throughout your careers. As students began gathering their materials, one approached the podium. Dr. Walsh, this is really different from how I've always thought about learning. It feels more sustainable. What do you mean by that? Well, when I just focus on getting better grades, I feel like I'm always chasing the next test, the next requirement. But when I focus on improving my thinking, it feels like I'm building something that will help me long term. Dr. Walsh nodded. That's exactly the difference between performance learning and strategic learning. Performance learning helps you succeed on the next test. Strategic learning helps you succeed in the next decade. As the auditorium emptied, Dr. Walsh reflected on the session. For the first time in her career as an educator, she felt like she had helped students develop not just medical knowledge, but the thinking skills they would need to navigate the uncertainty and complexity that awaited them in clinical practice. More importantly, she had given them tools for continuous improvement that didn't depend on external evaluation or feedback. They were learning to become strategic learners, people who could extract insights from any experience and continuously refine their thinking processes. Later that day, Dr. Walsh received an email from Sarah Martinez. Dr. Walsh, I applied the strategic learning questions to my study habits and realized I've been memorizing information instead of understanding concepts. I'm changing my approach for the next exam, but more importantly, I feel like I finally understand how to learn effectively. Thank you for showing us that failure isn't just about getting things wrong. It's about learning to think better. Dr. Walsh smiled as she read the message. Strategic learning wasn't just about improving academic performance. It was about developing the kind of thinking that would serve these students throughout their careers as physicians and as people. The feedback loop, she realized, wasn't just about getting better answers. It was about getting better at thinking. And that was a skill that would compound over time, creating not just better doctors, but better decision makers in every aspect of their lives. Chapter 9, The Influence Web. Elena Rodriguez stood in the marble lobby of the State Capitol building, watching legislators, lobbyists, and journalists weave through the corridors like dancers in elaborate ballet. As a newly elected state representative, she has spent her first 6 months in office learning the formal rules of governance, committee procedures, voting protocols, and parliamentary process. But what she was discovering was that the real work of creating change happened in the spaces between the formal structures. Today marked Elena's first attempt to build coalition support for the Educational Technology Access Act, a bill she had sponsored to provide internet connectivity and devices to underserved rural communities. On paper, the legislation seemed straightforward and widely beneficial. In practice, she was learning that even good ideas required sophisticated strategic thinking to navigate the complex web of interests, relationships, and competing priorities that define political reality. Elena checked her phone, 9:15 a.m. She had meetings scheduled every 30 minutes until 6 p.m. with various stakeholders whose support would be crucial for the bill's passage. But instead of charging into those meetings with her usual directness, she had decided to try something different. 3 days earlier, Elena had attended a workshop led by Dr. Robert Cialdini on strategic influence and persuasion. Dr. Cialdini had introduced concepts that challenged everything Elena thought she knew about creating change in complex systems. Most people approach influence like a debate, Dr. Cialdini had said. They gather their best arguments, present their evidence, and expect rational people to be persuaded by logical reasoning. But strategic influence requires understanding that people make decisions based on much more than logical analysis. Elena pulled out her notebook and reviewed the framework Dr. Cialdini had shared. Strategic influence framework. Map the ecosystem. Understand all stakeholders and their relationships. Identify core motivations. What does each person really care about? Find alignment opportunities. Where do interests overlap? Sequence your approach. Who influences whom, and in what order? Adapt your message. Different motivations require different framings. Elena had spent the previous evening creating what she called her influence map for the Educational Technology Access Act. Instead of thinking about stakeholders as allies or opponents, she had tried to understand their underlying motivations and concerns. Rural representatives. Concern about federal overreach. Focus on local control and economic development. Urban representatives, interested in equity issues, worried about resource allocation between rural and urban needs. Business community, interested in workforce development, concern about regulation and cost. Education groups, focus on student outcomes, worried about implementation complexity. Technology companies, interested in market opportunities, concerned about compliance. Requirements. Fiscal conservatives, focus on budget impact, skeptical of new government programs. As Elena walked toward her first meeting with Representative Tom Bradley, a fiscal conservative from a rural district, she reflected on how different this approach felt from her usual style. Typically, Elena would have entered the meeting armed with data about educational inequity, research on technology's impact on learning outcomes, and moral arguments about fairness. But Dr. Cialdini's workshop had helped her recognize that Representative Bradley's decision wouldn't be based primarily on her evidence or her passion for the issue. Instead, Elena knocked on Bradley's office door, carrying a folder containing information she had researched specifically for this conversation. Data on how internet access affects rural economic development. Examples of technology programs that had reduced rather than increased government spending, and testimonials from rural business owners about the workforce challenges they faced. Representative Bradley, Elena said as she settled into the chair across from his desk. Thank you for taking the time to meet. I know you're focused on fiscal responsibility and supporting rural economic development. So I want to discuss how the Educational Technology Access Act might actually serve both of those priorities. Bradley looked surprised. Most legislators who came to his office led with their policy goals and asked for his support. Elena was starting with the priorities and exploring how her proposal might align with them. I'm listening, Bradley said. Elena opened her folder. I've been researching communities that have implemented similar programs, and I found something interesting. Rural areas that improved internet access and technology skills actually saw increased small business formation and reduced long-term social service costs. She showed him a case study from a comparable rural district in Montana. This community invested in educational technology infrastructure 5 years ago. Since then, they've seen a 23% increase in small business startups, largely because young people who might have moved to cities for opportunities were able to build technology-based businesses locally. Bradley studied the data. That's intriguing, but what about the upfront costs? That's exactly what I wanted to discuss. The initial investment is significant, but look at these numbers. Elena showed him a cost-benefit analysis she had prepared. The program pays for itself within 3 years through increased tax revenue and reduced social service expenditures. Elena watched Bradley's expression change as he absorbed the information. Instead of defending against concerns about government spending, she was reframing the program as an investment in economic development. Representative Rodriguez, Bradley said slowly, "This is not how I expected this conversation to go." "What do you mean?" "Usually when colleagues want my support for education bills, they talk about helping kids and closing achievement gaps. You're talking about economic development and fiscal impact." Elena smiled. "Both can be true, can't they? Good education policy often aligns with good economic policy." "I need to think about this," Bradley said. "Can you leave these materials with me?" "Of course." And Representative Bradley, "I'd welcome your input on the bill's language. If there are ways to structure the program to better serve rural economic development goals, I'm open to those suggestions." As Elena left Bradley's office, she felt a shift in her understanding of strategic influence. Instead of trying to convince him to care about her priorities, she had explored how her proposal might serve his priorities. The approach felt less adversarial and more collaborative. Her next meeting was with Representative Linda Chun, who represented an urban district and chaired the Education Equity Subcommittee. Elena's approach would need to be completely different. "Representative Chun," Elena began after settling into Chen's office, "I want to discuss the Educational Technology Access Act with you, particularly the equity implications." "I've read your bill," Chen replied. "I'm concerned that it focuses exclusively on rural areas when urban districts also have significant technology gaps." Elena had anticipated this concern. "You're absolutely right, and that's actually something I hope we can work on together. The current bill focuses on rural areas because that's where my expertise lies, but the technology equity problem extends far beyond rural communities." She pulled out a different folder. This one focused on urban technology gaps and their impact on educational outcomes. "What if we thought about this bill as phase one of a broader technology equity initiative? We could use the rural implementation as a pilot to work out the challenges, then expand the model to address urban needs in a second phase." Chin looked interested. "Tell me more about that." "Well, rural and urban technology challenges are different, but they share some common elements. If we can demonstrate success in rural areas, it creates a foundation for arguing that technology equity should be a statewide priority." Elena showed Chin research on urban technology gaps she had compiled. "Your district has some of the highest concentrations of students without reliable internet access in the state. A successful rural program could provide the political momentum and practical framework for addressing those needs." "That's an interesting approach," Chin said. "But why not just include urban areas in the original bill?" Elena paused, considering how to explain the strategic thinking behind her approach. "Honestly, because I think a bill that tries to address both rural and urban technology needs simultaneously would be too complex to pass in the current political environment. But a targeted rural bill that succeeds could create momentum for broader technology equity initiatives." Chin nodded. "You're thinking sequentially rather than comprehensively." "Exactly. Sometimes strategic change requires patience and staging. What would you need from me to make this work?" Elena felt the conversation shifting from negotiation to collaboration. "Your expertise on urban technology issues and your support for the rural bill as a stepping stone toward more comprehensive equity legislation." "I can work with that approach," Chin said. "Let's stay in touch as this moves forward." Elena's afternoon meetings followed similar patterns, but each required different strategic approaches. With technology company representatives, she emphasized economic opportunities and workforce development. With education groups, she focused on student outcomes and implementation support. With budget analysts, she discussed cost effectiveness and measurement metrics. By 4 p.m., Elena was exhausted but exhilarated. She had never experienced political conversations that felt so productive and collaborative. Instead of fighting for her vision against other people's concerns, she was finding ways to align her goals with their interests. Her final meeting of the day was with Senator Patricia Williams, whose support would be crucial for passage in the upper chamber. Senator Williams was known for her skepticism of new government programs and her insistence on rigorous oversight. Senator Williams, Elena began, I know you have concerns about government efficiency and accountability, so I want to discuss how the Educational Technology Access Act incorporates oversight and performance measurement. She opened her laptop and showed Senator Williams a dashboard she had developed. The bill includes quarterly reporting requirements, specific performance metrics, and automatic sunset provisions if benchmarks aren't met. We're not just creating a program. We're creating an accountable program. Senator Williams studied the dashboard. This level of oversight is unusual for education legislation. I think that's a problem, Elena replied. Too many education programs are funded based on good intentions rather than measurable outcomes. This bill requires proof of impact. What happens if the program doesn't meet its benchmarks? Funding automatically decreases, and the program sunsets after 3 years unless specific success criteria are achieved. Senator Williams leaned back in her chair. Representative Rodriguez, I have to say, this is refreshing. Most education advocates resist this kind of accountability. I think accountability strengthens programs rather than weakening them. If we can't measure impact, how do we know we're actually helping students? I appreciate that perspective. Let me review the oversight mechanisms in detail, but I'm inclined to support this approach. As Elena walked back to her office that evening, she reflected on what she had learned about strategic influence. The day had been successful not because she had perfected her arguments, but because she had learned to see the issue from multiple perspectives and find genuine alignment between her goals and other people's interests. She pulled out her phone and called Dr. Cialdini. Dr. Cialdini, I wanted to thank you for the workshop last week. I just spent a day applying the strategic influence framework, and it completely changed how I approach building support for legislation. Tell me about the experience. Instead of trying to convince people to care about my priorities, I explored how my proposal might serve their priorities. The conversations felt collaborative rather than adversarial. And how did people respond? Much more positively than I expected. But the surprising thing was that finding alignment didn't require compromise in my values. It required understanding that other people's values might lead them to support the same outcomes for different reasons. Dr. Cialdini chuckled. That's exactly the insight that separates strategic influence from manipulation. Manipulation tries to get people to act against their interests. Strategic influence finds ways for people to pursue their interests while also advancing broader goals. I think I understand the difference now, Elena said. Strategic influence isn't about being more persuasive. It's about being more understanding. How so? When I really understood what each person cared about, I could see how my proposal might genuinely serve their interests. The influence came from genuine alignment, not clever persuasion. Elena paused, thinking about the implications of this approach. Dr. Cialdini, this feels like it could change how I approach all kinds of relationships and challenges, not just political ones. Strategic thinking about influence is really strategic thinking about human motivation and collaboration. Those skills are valuable in any context where you need to work with others to create change. As Elena ended the call and walked to her car, she thought about how much her understanding of leadership and influence had evolved in just one day. She had entered politics, thinking that good ideas and strong arguments would be sufficient to create change. But she was learning that effective leadership required something more sophisticated, the ability to understand different perspectives deeply enough to find genuine points of alignment. The Educational Technology Access Act was still far from passage, but Elena felt confident about the foundation she had built. More importantly, she felt like she had discovered a more sustainable and ethical approach to creating change in complex systems. Instead of fighting against resistance, she was learning to work with the motivations and interests that were already present. It required more patience and more strategic thinking, but it produced stronger coalitions and more durable outcomes. As she drove home through the Capital District, Elena realized that strategic influence wasn't just a political skill. It was a life skill that could improve any situation where people needed to work together effectively. She had discovered that the most powerful form of influence wasn't changing people's minds, but helping them see how their existing values and interests connected to broader possibilities for positive change. Chapter 10: The Integration Challenge. Dr. Michael Thompson sat in his corner office at the Boston Consulting Group, surrounded by whiteboard walls covered in strategy frameworks, process diagrams, and decision trees that represented 15 years of consulting expertise. Outside his windows, the Charles River reflected the late afternoon sun as Harvard crew teams practiced their synchronized rowing, a fitting metaphor for what he was trying to accomplish with his most challenging client engagement yet. 3 months earlier, Pinnacle Healthcare had hired BCG to help them navigate what their CEO called the perfect storm: simultaneous pressures from regulatory changes, technological disruption, market consolidation, and shifting patient expectations. It was a kind of complex, multidimensional challenge that traditionally would have been broken down into separate work streams: operations optimization, technology transformation, competitive positioning, and organizational change. But Michael had tried something different. Instead of decomposing the challenge into manageable pieces, he had approached it as what systems theorists called an integrated complexity, a situation where the interactions between different elements were as important as the elements themselves. The approach had produced insights that surprised everyone, including Michael. But it had also created a new problem. How do you help a leadership team make decisions when everything is connected to everything else? Michael's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Kim, Pinnacle's Chief Strategy Officer. Ready for tomorrow's board presentation? This better work, because we're betting the company on your integrated approach. Tomorrow's presentation would determine whether Pinnacle's board would approve a $200 million transformation strategy that touched every aspect of their business simultaneously. It was either brilliant strategic thinking or dangerously complex overreach. Michael walked to his whiteboard and reviewed the framework he had developed for what he called integrated strategic thinking, an approach that acknowledged the interconnected nature of complex challenges rather than trying to simplify them away. Traditional strategic consulting followed a linear process: diagnose the problem, generate alternatives, evaluate options, make recommendations, implement solutions. It was efficient, systematic, and completely inadequate for situations where changing one thing changed everything else. Michael's integrated approach was messier, but more realistic. Phase 1. Systems mapping. Understand how different elements influence each other. Phase 2. Leverage point identification. Find where small changes create big impacts. Phase 3. Dynamic scenario planning. Model how different combinations of changes interact. Phase 4. Integrated decision architecture. Design choices that optimize across multiple dimensions. Phase 5. Adaptive implementation. Execute while continuously adjusting based on emerging interactions. The Pinnacle engagement had become a laboratory for testing whether this approach could work in practice. Michael's computer chimed with a video call request from Dr. Margaret Blackwell, the organizational psychology consultant he had been working with to refine his integrated strategic thinking methods. Michael, Dr. Blackwell said as her image appeared on screen, "How are you feeling about tomorrow's presentation?" "Nervous," Michael admitted. "I believe in the approach, but I'm asking the board to approve something that's fundamentally different from how they usually think about strategy." "Tell me more about that." Michael turned his laptop so Dr. Blackwell could see his whiteboard. Traditional strategy assumes you can optimize different aspects of a business independently. But at Pinnacle, we discovered that their operational efficiency, technology investments, competitive positioning, and organizational culture are so interconnected that changing any one without considering the others actually makes things worse. He pointed to a complex diagram showing dozens of interconnected variables. For example, they want to implement new patient engagement technology to improve satisfaction scores. But the success of that technology depends on having staff who are trained and motivated to use it effectively. And staff motivation depends on organizational culture and change management. And culture change depends on leadership commitment and resource allocation. And resource allocation depends on short-term financial performance. Dr. Blackwell studied the diagram. So, you're saying that successful technology implementation requires simultaneously addressing culture, training, leadership, and finance? Exactly. But here's where it gets more complex. Their main competitor is implementing similar technology, so Pinnacle's timeline is constrained by competitive dynamics, and regulatory changes are creating new requirements that affect both the technology specifications and the training requirements. Michael walked to another section of his whiteboard. When we mapped all the interdependencies, we realized that Pinnacle doesn't have a technology problem or a culture problem or competitive problem. They have an integration problem. How did you approach solving an integration problem? By changing the question. Instead of asking, how do we optimize each element? We asked, how do we optimize the interactions between elements? Michael pulled up a presentation slide on his computer. We identified what we call leverage intersections, places where a single intervention creates positive effects across multiple domains. The slide showed 5 key interventions: integrated leadership development, training leaders in both technology and culture change, cross-functional innovation teams, groups that work on technology, operations, and culture simultaneously, adaptive performance metrics, measurements that track interactions, not just individual outcomes, phase integration rollout, implementation sequence that builds momentum across multiple areas, continuous feedback loops, systems for adjusting strategy based on emerging interactions. Instead of separate technology, culture, and competitive strategies, we designed interventions that advance all 3 simultaneously. Dr. Blackwell looked intrigued. Can you give me a specific example? Sure. Traditional approaches would have separate training programs for the new technology and separate change management initiatives for culture transformation. But we realized that the technology training could be designed to also model and reinforce the cultural behaviors they want to develop. Michael clicked to the next slide, showing the integrated training design. The technology training includes collaborative problem-solving exercises that demonstrate both how to use the new systems and how to work together more effectively. It addresses skill development, culture change, and technology adoption in a single intervention. That's elegant, Dr. Blackwell said, but also risky. What if the integration doesn't work as planned? That's exactly what's making me nervous about tomorrow's presentation. Integrated strategies are harder to adjust if they don't work, because all the pieces are connected. Michael sat back down at his desk. Dr. Blackwell, can I ask you something? In your experience, when do leaders choose integrated approaches versus traditional approaches? That's a perceptive question. Most leaders avoid integrated approaches because they're harder to control and harder to explain. Breaking complex problems into simple pieces feels safer. But simple approaches often fail when dealing with complex realities. The world is integrated whether we want it to be or not. Dr. Blackwell paused thoughtfully. Michael, you mentioned that this approach produced insights that surprised everyone. What kind of insights? Michael pulled up another section of his analysis. We discovered that Pinnacle's biggest competitive advantage wasn't what anyone expected. It wasn't their technology, their clinical expertise, or their market position. What was it? Their ability to adapt quickly to changing conditions. Their culture of collaboration and their decentralized decision-making processes made them more agile than larger competitors. Michael clicked through several data slides. But here's the paradox. They were about to invest heavily in systems and processes that would eliminate their adaptability advantage in favor of efficiency gains. So your integrated analysis revealed that their proposed strategy would destroy their core competitive advantage? Exactly. Traditional analysis would have evaluated each component separately and missed that pattern. But when we looked at the interactions between technology, culture, and competitive positioning, it became clear that they needed a completely different approach. Dr. Blackwell nodded. This is why integrated thinking is so important. Complex systems often behave in counterintuitive ways. Michael's phone rang. It was Sarah Kim from Pinnacle. Sarah, you're on speaker with Dr. Blackwell. What's on your mind? Michael, I've been reviewing tomorrow's presentation, and I'm getting cold feet. The board is expecting clear recommendations with predictable outcomes. What you're proposing feels like a leap of faith. Dr. Blackwell spoke up. Sarah, this is Margaret Blackwell. Can I ask what specifically concerns you about the integrated approach. It's so interconnected that I can't point to any single element and say, this will definitely work. Everything depends on everything else. And how does that compare to your current challenges? Sarah was quiet for a moment. Actually, that's exactly why we're in trouble. All our problems are interconnected, but we've been trying to solve them separately. Michael leaned forward. Sarah, what if we framed tomorrow's presentation differently? Instead of asking the board to approve a complex integrated strategy, what if we asked them to approve an integrated approach to strategy development? What's the difference? We present the integrated thinking process and the insights it's generated, but we propose implementing it through a series of pilot projects that test the interconnections before scaling up. Dr. Blackwell smiled. That's strategic thinking about strategic thinking. You're making the approach less risky by making it more experimental. Sarah sounded more interested. How would that work? Michael started sketching on his whiteboard as he talked. Phase 1. Implement the integrated leadership development and cross-functional innovation teams as pilots. Measure not just their individual effectiveness, but how they interact with existing systems. Phase 2. Based on what we learned from the pilots, design the next level of integration, the adaptive performance metrics and phase rollout. Phase 3. Use insights from phases 1 and 2 to finalize the comprehensive transformation strategy. So instead of betting everything on an integrated plan, we're betting on an integrated planning process. Exactly. We use the same integrated thinking, but we reduce the implementation risk by building evidence as we go. Sarah was quiet for several minutes. Then, Michael, I think that's brilliant. It gives us the benefits of integrated thinking while addressing the board's concerns about complexity and risk. After ending the call, Dr. Blackwell looked at Michael with approval. What you just did was apply strategic thinking to your own strategic thinking. You recognized that the resistance to your approach was valid, and you found a way to honor both the insights from integrated analysis and the concerns about integrated implementation. Michael felt something click into place. Dr. Blackwell, I think I just learned something important about consulting and about strategic thinking in general. What's that? The goal isn't to create perfect strategies. The goal is to create better strategic thinking processes. He walked back to his whiteboard and wrote, Strategic thinking is not equal to strategic planning. Strategic planning tries to predict and control the future. Strategic thinking tries to improve decision-making in uncertainty. Dr. Blackwell nodded. And integrated strategic thinking acknowledges that complex challenges require ongoing adaptation rather than perfect initial solutions. Michael spent the rest of the evening revising his presentation for the Pinnacle board. Instead of presenting a comprehensive transformation plan, he would present an integrated thinking process and propose testing it through carefully designed experiments. The next morning, Michael stood before Pinnacle's board of directors in their glass-walled conference room overlooking Boston Harbor. Instead of the complex strategy document they expected, he had prepared a simple framework focused on process rather than predetermined outcomes. Board members, he began. Over the past 3 months, we've discovered that Pinnacle's challenges are more interconnected than anyone realized. Today, I want to share what we've learned and propose an approach that acknowledges that complexity rather than trying to simplify it away. He clicked to his first slide. Integrated strategic thinking, a process for complex challenges. Traditional strategic planning assumes you can break complex problems into simple pieces, solve each piece separately, and reassemble them into solutions. But at Pinnacle, we've discovered that the interactions between different elements are as important as the elements themselves. The board members looked skeptical, but they were listening. For example, your technology upgrade, culture transformation, and competitive positioning initiatives aren't separate projects. They're different aspects of the same systemic challenge. Michael showed them the systems map his team had created, with dozens of interconnected variables affecting Pinnacle's performance. What we're proposing is not a detailed implementation plan, but a proven process for navigating complexity through integrated thinking and adaptive execution. He outlined a pilot approach he had developed with Sarah and Dr. Blackwell, emphasizing how it would reduce risk while building evidence for larger-scale integration. The goal isn't to predict exactly what Pinnacle will look like in 3 years. The goal is to build your capability to adapt strategically as conditions change. Dr. Patricia Walsh, Pinnacle's board chair, raised her hand. Michael, this sounds more like a philosophy than a strategy. How do we measure success? That's exactly the right question. We measure success not just by outcomes, but by the quality of your strategic thinking process and your ability to adapt as you learn. Michael showed them the adaptive metrics framework his team had developed. We track both performance improvements and learning acceleration. The question isn't just, are we getting better results? It's also, are we getting better at getting better results? The presentation continued for another hour, with board members asking detailed questions about implementation, risk management, and resource requirements. But Michael noticed something different about the discussion. Instead of trying to nail down every detail of the plan, they were engaging with the thinking process itself. At the end of the presentation, Dr. Walsh called for a brief recess before the board vote. Michael, she said as other board members filed out, I have to admit, this is not what I expected, but it's the first strategic recommendation I've seen that acknowledges how complex our reality actually is. How so? Most consultants give us plans that assume we can control variables we can't actually control. You're giving us a process for dealing with the variables we can't control. 30 minutes later, the board voted unanimously to approve the integrated strategic thinking approach with the pilot structure Michael had proposed. As Michael packed up his materials, he reflected on what he had learned. Integrated strategic thinking wasn't just about analyzing complex systems. It was about designing processes that could navigate complexity over time. The real insight wasn't that everything was connected. The real insight was that effective strategy required thinking processes that could handle interconnection and adaptation simultaneously. Walking along the Charles River after the meeting, Michael called Dr. Blackwell to share the outcome. The board approved the approach. But more importantly, I think I finally understand what integrated strategic thinking really means. Tell me, it's not about creating more complex strategies. It's about creating strategic thinking processes that can handle complexity effectively. And what's the difference? Michael watched the Harvard crew teams practicing their synchronized rowing, each rower adapting continuously to the rhythm of the group while maintaining focus on their individual technique. Complex strategies try to predict and control interconnected variables. Integrated strategic thinking accepts that interconnection requires ongoing adaptation and builds that assumption into the process itself. That's a profound insight, Michael. How do you feel about applying it beyond this engagement? Michael realized that integrated strategic thinking had implications far beyond business consulting. Any situation involving multiple stakeholders, competing priorities, and changing conditions could benefit from this approach. I think I've discovered a different way of thinking about strategy, leadership, and decision-making in general. Instead of trying to simplify complex challenges, we can learn to think strategically within complexity. As he walked back toward his office, Michael felt like he had discovered something that would change not just his consulting practice, but his entire approach to navigating complex challenges in any domain of life. The goal wasn't to eliminate complexity. It was to develop the thinking skills necessary to thrive within it. Epilogue, the ripple effect. 1 year later, Dr. Margaret Blackwell stood once again at the podium in Pembroke University's philosophy department. But this time the scene was different. The lecture hall was packed not just with students, but with faculty, professionals, and even some of the individuals whose stories had shaped their course over the past year. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating faces that reflected a year of growth, challenge, and transformation. Before we begin today's discussion, Dr. Blackwell said, I want to share something with you. When I started teaching this course on critical thinking and strategic decision-making, I thought I was helping students develop professional skills. What I discovered was that we were all learning to live differently. She gestured towards several familiar faces in the audience. Over the past year, I've had the privilege of following the journeys of several individuals who discovered that strategic thinking isn't just a business tool or an academic concept. It's a way of approaching life that creates ripple effects far beyond what any of us initially imagined. In the third row, James Morrison sat with his girlfriend Lisa, whom he had met 6 months earlier during a community volunteer project. The data analyst who had once believed that more information always led to better decisions now understood the difference between analysis and wisdom. His work at Meridian Industries had evolved from purely quantitative analysis to what his colleagues called strategic intelligence, the ability to combine rigorous analysis with contextual understanding and human insight. James, Dr. Blackwell said, "Would you mind sharing what you've learned about the relationship between data and strategic thinking?" James stood, looking more confident than the anxious analyst who had struggled with the Hartwell acquisition a year earlier. "I learned that data without context is just noise," he said. "Strategic thinking isn't about having perfect information. It's about asking the right questions and understanding what the information means in the real world." He paused, reflecting on his journey. But the bigger insight was personal. I was using analysis to avoid uncertainty rather than to navigate it. Strategic thinking taught me that uncertainty isn't a problem to solve. It's a condition to manage wisely. Near the back of the room, Sarah Peterson sat with her team from TechFlow Solutions. The project manager who had once lived in constant crisis mode now led what the company considered its most effective and sustainable development group. Her discovery that not everything urgent was important had transformed not just her work, but her team's entire approach to project management. "Sarah," Dr. Blackwell continued, "you become known for helping teams distinguish between urgent and important. What's the most surprising thing you've learned about time and priority management?" Sarah smiled. "That slowing down actually speeds things up. When we stopped reacting to every urgent request and started thinking strategically about what really mattered, we became more productive, not less." She looked at her team members in the audience. But the real transformation was cultural. We went from being order takers to strategic partners with our clients. Instead of just saying yes to impossible timelines, we help clients think through what they really need and when they really need it. Dr. Emily Rodriguez sat with her husband Carlos and their 2 teenage children. The surgeon who had learned to apply strategic thinking in the operating room had discovered that the same principles transformed her approach to parenting, marriage, and personal health. Her reputation at St. Mary's Medical Center had evolved from technical expert to what colleagues called a systems thinker, someone who understood that optimal patient care required considering factors far beyond immediate medical needs. "Dr. Rodriguez," Dr. Blackwell said, "you've applied strategic thinking in contexts ranging from surgery to family life. What's a common thread?" Emily stood, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had learned to integrate professional expertise with personal wisdom. "The common thread is asking better questions. In surgery, instead of just, 'How do I fix this problem?' I ask, 'How do I optimize this patient's complete outcome?' In parenting, instead of, 'How do I solve this conflict?' I ask, 'How do I help my children develop their own problem-solving skills?'" She paused, thinking about the broader implications. Strategic thinking taught me that every decision is really about designing systems, whether that's a surgical procedure, a family culture, or a personal health plan. Thomas Bennett sat with Rachel, now his fiancée, having finally learned to make important decisions without drowning in endless analysis. The data scientist had successfully navigated his career transition using the strategic life design approach, and was now working part-time for a corporate client while building an educational technology nonprofit. His struggle with analysis paralysis had become a strength. He was now sought after for his ability to help others make complex decisions efficiently. "Thomas," Dr. Blackwell said, "you become somewhat of an expert on decision-making under uncertainty. What advice would you give to someone struggling with a complex choice?" Thomas stood, holding Rachel's hand, a simple gesture that represented his growth in trusting relationships and accepting support. "I'd tell them that the goal isn't to make perfect decisions. It's to make good decisions and then learn for whatever happens. Strategic thinking taught me to design experiments instead of betting everything on single choices." He looked around the room. The biggest shift was realizing that most decisions are reversible if you structure them thoughtfully. Instead of asking, "What if I'm wrong?" I learned to ask, "How can I structure this choice to minimize downside while maximizing learning?" Amanda Foster sat with her leadership team from Nexus Consulting, who had driven down from Chicago specifically for this session. The COO who had discovered the difference between individual strategic thinking and collective strategic Thinking Now led what the company considered its most innovative and aligned leadership group. Her approach to strategic facilitation had become a model that other Nexus offices were adopting. Amanda, Dr. Blackwell said, "You've transformed your understanding of leadership. What's the most important insight you'd share with other leaders?" Amanda stood with the easy confidence of someone who had learned to trust collaborative wisdom over individual expertise. "I learned that my job isn't to be the smartest person in the room. It's to help the room think smartly together." Strategic leadership means creating conditions where teams can do strategic thinking collectively. She gestured toward her colleagues. "The transformation wasn't just in my leadership style. It was in our entire approach to complex problems. Instead of assigning smart people to work on problems individually, we designed processes where smart people can think through problems together." Rebecca and David Chin sat together, holding hands, an image that would have been unimaginable during their divorce mediation a year earlier. The couple who had nearly ended their marriage due to misunderstood assumptions had not only reconciled, but had become stronger than ever. Their experience with strategic thinking in relationships had led them to become volunteer mediators, helping other couples distinguish between facts and interpretations. Rebecca and David, Dr. Blackwell said, "You've experienced firsthand how strategic thinking can transform relationships. What's the most important lesson you'd share?" Rebecca and David exchanged a glance. Then Rebecca spoke for both of them. "We learned that most relationship conflicts aren't really about what people do. They're about the stories we tell ourselves about why people do what they do." David nodded. "Strategic thinking in relationships means getting curious about each other's motivations instead of defending against your own assumptions." Rebecca continued, "The biggest change was learning to investigate our interpretations instead of acting on them. When David does something that bothers me, instead of assuming I know why he did it, I ask." Marcus Williams sat with Nina, his sister, who had flown in from Chicago to attend the session. The engineer who had struggled with a career transition had successfully implemented his three-phase strategic life design and was now in the process of launching his own educational technology company while maintaining part-time consulting relationships. His approach to strategic patience and experimental decision-making had become a model for other professionals navigating career transitions. "Marcus," Dr. Blackwell said, "you've successfully navigated a complex career transition using strategic thinking principles. What would you tell someone facing a similar choice?" Marcus stood, emanating the calm confidence of someone who had learned to trust process over outcomes. "I'd tell them that strategic thinking isn't about making perfect plans. It's about designing good processes for navigating uncertainty. Instead of trying to predict the future, focus on building capabilities that will serve you no matter what future emerges." He looked at Nina, who smiled encouragingly. "The most important insight was learning to distinguish between irreversible and reversible decisions. Most choices that feel permanent are actually experiments if you structure them thoughtfully." Dr. Jennifer Walsh sat with several of her medical students, who had requested permission to attend this session after experiencing her transformed approach to medical education. The professor who had revolutionized feedback and learning had been promoted to Associate Dean of Medical Education, and her strategic learning frameworks were being adopted by medical schools nationwide. "Dr. Walsh," Dr. Blackwell said, "you've changed how future physicians learn to think. What's the most important principle you'd share about strategic learning?" Jennifer stood, carrying herself with the authority of someone who had discovered how to accelerate human development. "I learned that the goal isn't just to perform better, it's to get better at getting better. Strategic learning means focusing on thinking processes, not just thinking outcomes." She looked at her students. "We teach medical students to diagnose and treat patients, but we rarely teach them to diagnose and improve their own thinking. Strategic learning makes that invisible process visible and improvable." Elena Rodriguez sat with several members of the coalition that had successfully passed the Educational Technology Access Act, which was now being implemented as a model for other states. The state representative who had learned to navigate political influence strategically had been elected to Congress the previous fall, and her collaborative approach to building coalitions had become a case study in effective political leadership. Representative Rodriguez, Dr. Blackwell said, "You've demonstrated how strategic thinking can create change in complex political systems." What's your key insight about influence and persuasion? Elena stood with the poise of someone who had learned to find alignment rather than force compliance. I learned that strategic influence isn't about changing people's minds. It's about helping people see how their existing values and interests connect to broader possibilities for positive change. She gestured toward her coalition colleagues. The most powerful form of influence is collaborative thinking. Instead of trying to convince people to support my ideas, I learned to think with them about how we can all achieve what we care about. Finally, Dr. Michael Thompson sat with Sarah Kim from Pinnacle Healthcare and Dr. Blackwell herself. The consultant who had discovered integrated strategic thinking was now leading BCG's new practice in complexity management, helping organizations navigate challenges that couldn't be broken down into simple components. Michael, Dr. Blackwell said, "You've pioneered approaches to thinking strategically about complexity itself. What's the most important insight you'd share?" Michael stood, embodying the confidence of someone who had learned to thrive in uncertainty rather than just survive it. "I learned that complex challenges require integrated thinking, not just comprehensive planning. The goal isn't to predict and control complex systems. It's to develop thinking processes that can navigate complexity effectively." He looked around the room at all the other participants. But the most profound insight was meta-level. Strategic thinking isn't just a problem-solving tool. It's a way of engaging with life that creates better outcomes and more fulfilling experiences. Dr. Blackwell walked to the front of the room, taking in the faces of people who had transformed not just their professional capabilities, but their entire approach to living. "What I want you all to understand," she said, "is that you represent something remarkable. You've demonstrated that strategic thinking isn't just an academic concept or a business skill. It's a learnable way of approaching challenges that creates ripple effects throughout every aspect of life." She turned to address the broader audience. Each of these individuals discovered that when you change how you think about problems, you change the kinds of solutions that become available. When you change your decision-making processes, you change the quality of your choices. When you change how you learn from experience, you change how quickly you grow. Dr. Blackwell walked closer to the students in the front rows. "But here's what I want you to understand. Strategic thinking isn't about becoming perfect decision makers. It's about becoming more intentional, more curious, and more adaptive in how you navigate the inevitable uncertainties and complexities of life." She paused, reflecting on the year of transformation she had witnessed. The individuals you've heard from today didn't just learn new techniques. They developed new identities. Instead of being people who react to circumstances, they became people who respond strategically. Instead of being victims of uncertainty, they became navigators of complexity. A student in the front row raised her hand. "Dr. Blackwell, is strategic thinking something that becomes automatic, or do you have to keep working at it?" Dr. Blackwell smiled. "That's exactly the right question. Strategic thinking is like physical fitness. It's not a destination you reach, but a capacity you maintain and continue developing." James Morrison stood up. "If I can add to that, I think strategic thinking becomes a habit, but it's a habit of questioning your own habits. I'm always catching myself falling back into reactive patterns and asking, is there a more strategic way to approach this?" Sarah Peterson nodded. "For me, it's become a way of life. I naturally pause before reacting, ask strategic questions, and look for patterns. But I still have to be intentional about it." Dr. Rodriguez added, "What I've noticed is that strategic thinking gets easier with practice, but the challenges get more complex. As I've grown in my ability to think strategically, I've started applying it to bigger and more complex aspects of life." Dr. Blackwell returned to the podium. "What you're all describing is what I call strategic living, the integration of strategic thinking principles into your daily experience of being human." She clicked to a final slide. "The strategic mind, a way of being." Strategic living means pausing before reacting, asking better questions, seeking to understand before seeking to be understood, focusing on what you can control while accepting what you cannot, learning from every experience, thinking in terms of systems and patterns, designing choices that honor multiple values, building capabilities for navigating uncertainty. She looked around the room one final time. The goal isn't to eliminate complexity, uncertainty, or conflict from your lives. The goal is to develop the thinking skills that allow you to engage with complexity, uncertainty, and conflict more effectively. Dr. Blackwell smiled as she prepared to close the session. Strategic thinking is ultimately about freedom. The freedom that comes from responding to life intentionally rather than reactively. It's about becoming the kind of person who can navigate whatever challenges emerge with wisdom, creativity, and resilience. As the session ended and people began to mingle, Dr. Blackwell observed something beautiful. The individuals whose stories had shaped her course were now sharing insights with each other, learning from each other's experiences, and building on each other's discoveries. James Morrison was discussing data interpretation with Dr. Walsh's medical students. Sarah Peterson was sharing project management insights with Amanda Foster's leadership team. Elena Rodriguez was exploring coalition-building strategies with Rebecca and David Chen. The ripple effect was continuing, expanding beyond anything Dr. Blackwell had initially imagined when she first challenged her students to practice the 3-second pause. Later that evening, as Dr. Blackwell walked across the campus where her journey into strategic thinking had begun, she reflected on what she had learned from watching these transformations unfold. Strategic thinking wasn't just about making better decisions or solving problems more effectively. It was about developing a different relationship with life itself, one characterized by curiosity rather than certainty, learning rather than knowing, and wisdom rather than cleverness. The individuals whose stories had unfolded over the past year had discovered that strategic thinking was really strategic living, the practice of engaging with complexity, uncertainty, and change in ways that honor both their analytical capabilities and their human wisdom. As she reached her office, Dr. Blackwell opened her journal and wrote, "The strategic mind isn't about thinking faster or harder. It's about thinking more wisely. It's about developing the kind of thinking that serves not just our professional goals, but our deepest aspirations for how we want to live and who we want to become. The ultimate goal of strategic thinking is not perfect decisions or optimal outcomes. The ultimate goal is the development of human beings who can engage with the full complexity of life with wisdom, creativity, and compassion." She closed her journal and looked out her window at the campus where the next generation of strategic thinkers was already beginning their own journeys of discovery. The ripple effect would continue, spreading through decisions large and small, through relationships and organizations, through challenges and opportunities that hadn't yet emerged. Strategic thinking had revealed itself to be more than a skill or tool. It was a way of being human that honored both the complexity of the world and the wisdom inherent in thoughtful, intentional engagement with that complexity. The journey toward strategic living was just beginning,